It took a funeral and a 3-year-old to take my blinders off and force me to face what I had known for a long time. I didn't want to see this. I ignored it as long as I could, but suddenly I was right in front of it. The funeral was for the death of my maternal grandfather, who died of a massive heart attack, and the 3-year-old child was my daughter Alice. We were at my mother's house the day after the funeral, getting ready to leave and return home. The luggage was collected and loaded into the trunk of our Navigator, and I placed Alice in her child's seat. "Do you want to take off your shoes, honey?" I asked. I knew the answer, but I liked asking because she answered, and I liked hearing her childish voice. "Yes, please," she said solemnly and very clearly. I smiled at her and began to undo the straps of her little Mary Jane shoes. I didn't ask if she wanted to take off her socks. The answer was always yes. It was clearly something from my family. I myself would rather go barefoot than endure hot and uncomfortable skin. When the socks were off and her toes began to wiggle in obvious relief, I tickled her soles. She knew that I would do this, and she watched carefully, waiting for the moment when she could scream and kick her legs, as if she wanted to escape from my tickling fingers. But I really didn't want to. She would be upset if I didn't do this. It was a game that we played often, and that we both really appreciated. It struck me that we've been playing this game quite a lot lately. My daughter and I spent more and more time together. It seemed that we both treasured the hours we spent in each other's company. But this did not happen to my wife, Laura. Before I could even contemplate this thought, my angelic little daughter interrupted my thoughts. "Dad?" asked Alice. I leaned past her, placing her boots on the seat next to her. I carefully rolled up each sock and tucked it into its corresponding shoe, then pressed them lightly into the cushion to keep them in place. "What is it, my pumpkin?" I asked affectionately. When she didn't answer right away, I turned and looked her in the eyes. "Why doesn't Mom love us anymore?" she asked simply. I was stunned. I looked at my daughter for a moment, unable to answer. "Honey, I'm sure your mother loves us both," I said slowly, "and she especially loves you more than anything in the world," I assured her. For a moment there was a sparkle in her eyes, but then it went out. "But she didn't want to come with us to say goodbye to grandfather," she said pitifully. I had no other answer than what Laura gave. "She had to work, honey," I said. I was going to explain about the most important account at the accounting firm my wife worked for and how it required so much of her time and attention, but that would have raised too many questions in a 3-year-old's head. I was silent for a long time. "Mom will be home when you get back, baby," I said comfortingly. "She will be waiting for you." "Does she need to work at night too?" asked Alice. I wanted to answer that no, but her mother often went out in the evenings with the girls to relax. But this would again raise too many questions in Alice's mind. "No, honey," I said. "I think Mom is almost done working so much, and she will have a lot more time to spend with you." "And with me," I said. Suddenly, I realized that I needed to stop this conversation. He was too unpleasant. I fastened the last strap on the car seat, kissed my little devil, and patted her hand before closing the door. 20 minutes later, she was sleeping peacefully in the back seat as I drove the big SUV down the freeway. My daughter was sleeping, but I couldn't. I kept replaying her sad words in my head. If even a 3-year-old child notices, it means it's not just me anymore. This is exactly what my wife was hinting at the last time I asked why she went out with her friends so often. The sun had almost set when we arrived at the house. My wife Laura was indeed at home. Alice ran upstairs, excited and full of stories about all the cousins she had met at my parents'. I followed, still consumed by the dark thoughts that had taken root in my head during the ride home. Why does my wife spend so much time at work or partying with her friends? I found Laura sitting in front of the mirror, applying makeup in her lingerie. She stood up to kiss me on the cheek in greeting. It suddenly dawned on me that I couldn't remember the last time she kissed me passionately and hugged me, showing me how much she loved me. I sat on our bed and watched. Alice talked to her for a while, but her mother hardly responded. It was obvious even to little Alice that Laura was not paying attention to her, and after a while our daughter became quiet and quietly went to her room. Laura continued to preen herself, straightening her hair and applying her makeup precisely. "What's going on, Laura?" I asked, trying to hide the sudden excitement in my voice. My abdominal muscles suddenly tightened, and I felt a rush of blood to the back of my head. It was difficult to breathe. "What do you mean, dear?" she answered. She didn't notice my sudden nervousness and continued to pay full attention to the mascara wand next to her right eye. "We've only been home for 10 minutes, I said sharply, "and you're already in a hurry to get somewhere?" She stopped applying color to her eyelashes and looked at me with poorly hidden impatience. "Darling, you know that I always go out with the girls on Fridays," she said in a tired voice, as if we had already discussed this many times. I didn't like her tone and the implication that she was doing something that we supposedly agreed upon. "Actually, my dear," I said sarcastically, "you go out with the girls on Saturdays, sometimes on Sundays, almost every Wednesday, and almost every Friday night after work for happy hour, and sometimes it all blurs into one. A long, painful night for you." Alice quietly disappeared after being ignored by her mother and sat in her room with the door closed. I heard the tune of one of her educational toys. Standing up, I closed the bedroom door and turned to see that Laura had also stood up and was looking at me without any expression. Moving quickly, I walked up to her and took both her hands in mine. I pressed them to my chest. "Laura," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice under control. I didn't want him to break at that moment. "Darling, Alice asked me today why you don't love us anymore. And Laura, I think I should ask you this question too." Laura narrowed her eyes the way she always did when I entered forbidden territory. I ignored the sign and continued. "Do you love me?" I asked my wife, with whom I had been for 6 years. She didn't answer for a moment. Then, with an effort, she suppressed her visible irritation and pressed herself closer to me. "Of course, dear," she said softly. "I love you today even more than on our wedding day." And then I sometimes thought that I would die of happiness. My abdominal muscles were still tense, but I tried to relax. Was she happy? But not now. "Then stay home tonight, honey," I said, ignoring my sudden doubts. I refused to let my voice sound pleading. Laura sighed, patted me, and stroked my chest. "We can put Alice to bed early," I said. "We'll dim the lights, get out that bottle of wine we've been saving, and you wear that black lace top I bought you for Valentine's Day. What do you think?" It's strange, her body at first seemed supportive of my idea, until I mentioned the top. As soon as I said the word, her body tensed and she tried to pull away. I held her tightly by the wrists and did not let her go far. "Laura," I said with emphasis, "are you cheating on me?" I watched her closely as I said this, and there it was. I saw a quick glimmer deep in her eyes and a subtle tension in the corners of her eyes. They disappeared as quickly as they appeared, but I managed to notice it. I heard a sharp intake of breath as she sucked in a sharp breath. What didn't go away was the sudden quickening of my pulse, which I could feel in my fingertips. I held her close to me by the wrists, and the pads of my first 2 fingers were on the main blood vessels. It was as reliable as any FBI polygraph. I got my answer. "Don't be stupid," my wife protested. "Darling, I couldn't love anyone but you. You know that," she said. She pressed herself close to me, resting her head on my shoulder to gently breathe into my neck and kiss me here and there. I noticed that her head wasn't pressed down hard enough to ruin her hairstyle. I wonder if Laura felt the chill that ran down my spine. Laura patted the top of my arms and pulled away, looking at the clock next to the bed. "I'll be late," she said, "and I promised the girls I wouldn't be late again. I have to go, but maybe tomorrow evening," she asked softly. "Laura, we really need to spend time together," I replied, not really hiding my growing irritation. "Tell the girls that you'll see them another time and spend tonight with me and our daughter. How about that?" I suggested. She pulled away and went to the closet to put on a short skirt. "I can't let my friends down," she protested. "Why do you want me to do this?" she said with irritation. "Why do you want to let me and your daughter down?" I answered sharply. "Or are we no longer important to you?" My wife's eyes narrowed as she began to work herself up to a level of anger comparable to mine. "I told you tomorrow," she snapped. "Damn it, I deserve to have some time to myself without you always being there suffocating me. I'm not your slave, you know." We continued the argument. She stated that she was a free and independent part of this marriage, that I could not tell her what to do, and that she would do whatever she needed to relax and let off steam after a hard day at work. I said that I always gave her enough space. I said the proof of this was that she never heard a word of protest from me when she returned to work after the baby was born. I said I thought it was great that she was working as a middle manager at an accounting firm when I actually made enough money that we could live just fine without her working. I said I was proud of her career and all her accomplishments, but I didn't see why her work and partying with the girls should come before the needs of her family. I think I was being a little sarcastic when I mentioned girls. This made her even angrier. She asked what I was accusing her of. And then I left. I was too upset and too nervous to continue this conversation. I might say something I would regret later, so I went downstairs and sat on the living room couch. I sat there seething with anger, half determined to physically stop her from leaving at least that evening. But I knew, even through my anger, that I couldn't do it. When she came down the stairs, I was relatively calm. We looked at each other. She was full of challenges, and I didn't even know what I was feeling, but it was definitely something bad. "Laura," I said, "please don't do this." My voice involuntarily became hoarse and deep. She paused at the door for a moment, as if hesitating, but then opened it. "Laura," I said a little louder and more insistently. "Darling, I love you. I beg you, please don't do this to me or Alice." Laura looked back at me, and her face was completely devoid of any emotion. Then she decisively stepped over the threshold and closed the door behind her. Alice ran down the stairs into the hallway. She opened the front door and watched as the headlights of her mother's Lexus disappeared down the street. Without saying a word, she closed the door and quickly walked to the sofa. I recognized this walk. It was as if the polished marble floor of the hallway was too hot to walk on, and she needed to get away from it as quickly as possible. She climbed onto the sofa next to me and stared at the door for a long time, as if hoping that her mother would miraculously return. I watched too. After a while, Alice climbed onto my lap, and we hugged for a long time before I carried her into the kitchen and made us a couple of sandwiches. It was a cold and unpleasant weekend between Laura and me. She returned home in the early hours of the morning and spent most of Saturday suffering from a hangover that was so severe that the slightest noise hurt her. After putting up with Laura's temper for a while, Alice and I decided to leave and went to the park, not returning home until dinner. Laura didn't like this at all. When Alice and I returned, she launched into a long tirade about how her husband and daughter had abandoned her. I tolerated this for a while, but soon I got tired of it all. I told her that she had caused this by leaving us and abandoning her daughter the night before. I told her that she would have to accept that Alice and I were alone that day, and that it would probably happen again, and we had a great time. "Let him deal with it as he wants," I said. "However she deals with it," I added, "do it in a civilized manner or shut up altogether." I had never spoken to her like that before, and it took Laura by surprise. Shock, if nothing else, silenced her and gave her attention to Alice for the rest of the evening. Noticing a warming in her attitude late Saturday afternoon, I tried to initiate some tentative display of affection, but Laura's stomach hurt again, and we had to stop when she ran to the bathroom. I tried again on Sunday evening, but Laura lay there like a log, completely unresponsive. Instead of continuing, I turned away and lay there, seething with anger. After a while, I got up and went to take another shower, hoping that the sound of the water would calm me down a little and help me fall asleep. This only partially helped. On Monday morning, I left the house before Laura got up. I rarely did this because it meant that Laura would have to get Alice up, dressed, fed, and taken to kindergarten herself. My wife didn't like it. If she didn't have everything prepared in advance, it guaranteed she would be late for work by at least half an hour, maybe more. But that day, I wasn't in the mood to be particularly concerned about Laura's wants and needs. Before I left, I went down to the basement, opened a cabinet that seemed like just a place to store miscellaneous tools, and turned on a small device that recorded every conversation on the landline phone in my house. The second switch activated a device that intercepted all calls from mobile phones within a radius of 45 meters. It wasn't exactly legal, but no one knew about it, and I never intended to use the recordings for legal purposes. CCTV cameras already covered almost every room in the house. After I watched a documentary on A&E or Discovery about how a murder was solved thanks to images found on security cameras in a house, I installed them everywhere. The secondary purpose was to monitor the nannies that Laura and I hired for Alice, as well as the housekeeper who came 3 times a week. We trusted the housekeeper, as well as the teenage girls we hired to look after our baby for a few hours when Laura and I sometimes went out alone, but the trust but verify principle seemed reasonable to me. I thought it had been a long time since I had to hire a nanny. I wasn't sure if my expensive CCTV system was going to pay for itself. I parked inside the tall chain-link fence surrounding the new campus and drove to the office on the far side of the complex. After winning our first contract with the Department of Defense 3 years ago, we installed a fence and barbed wire on top of it. After this, the Ministry of Defense returned twice more with additional small but much more profitable orders. I pulled into the allocated parking space and turned off the engine. I sat motionless, trying to make a decision. My intuition told me that Laura had an outside interest, but my mind objected, saying that I had no real evidence. The rapid pulse and sharp intake of breath were not enough to be sure. I saw a glimmer of guilt in her eyes, but she could be feeling guilty about something completely different, only tangentially related to what I asked. At least that's what I hoped. The logo on the wall in front of my navigator suddenly disappeared, and it brought me out of my stupor. I nodded hello to Phil Sanders, one of the first people I hired. Opening the door, I gave him a quick hello and busied myself with getting my PDA and briefcase out of the back seat. Instead of going straight inside, I looked at the bright logo. Ma Industries. It's me, Mark Archer. At 34 years old, I was the CEO and president of a small private company that started out as a tool manufacturer 12 years ago. We have found our niche producing motorized, rotating mounts for home security cameras. Working tirelessly, we established relationships with a number of private detective agencies that required high-quality surveillance equipment. Over time, we have built a strong base of customers who have come to trust us to supply high-quality, remote-controlled mounts. 8 years ago, we bought out a small company that made excellent color cameras with impressive optical zooms. The entire set, including a powerful transmitter and a separate receiver that could be connected to a regular TV, was smaller than a woman's lipstick. Now my small corporation owned the entire stake, and we began selling our products throughout the state and also planned to start selling online. After that, we absorbed a couple of private detective agencies and merged them into a division called Information and Observational Associations. A year later, we had branches in 3 other cities. Overall, Massachusetts Industries prospered, although we maintained a fairly low profile. In my office, I signed papers that my secretary office manager placed in front of me without even looking. It was a folder of routine documents that didn't require my attention, but did require my signature. I used to tease her by calling her Radar, like the hero of the series, and now I said it again. She responded, as always, with a sarcastic remark directed at Colonel Potter to encourage him to pay more attention to his work. Maggie was the one who kept our office tidy. When she went on vacation, the office would become chaotic, and I dreaded the day she would come and say she was retiring. To delay this day as long as possible, I paid her the same as each of the 3 vice presidents of the company. She knew about it. They didn't. Maggie, I said as she brought me my first cup of coffee of the day. Maggie, can you ask Carl Winters to come see me? Of course, she answered quickly. She looked at me curiously. Can I ask why? I shook my head, but almost immediately changed my mind. I needed to tell her something as a partial explanation. Maggie has been like a second mother to me since we started working in an old warehouse converted into an office many years ago. Just tell him I need to become his client, I said slowly, without looking at Maggie. She was silent for some time. Oh my gosh, she said quietly. I'm so sorry, Mark. She sobbed quietly, bit her lips, and quickly left. I looked after her, wondering what she knew or perhaps guessed. Carl headed our combined surveillance and private investigations unit, and Maggie understood something from my request to become his client. The fact that she accepted my need without asking questions was alarming to me. What happened, Mark? Carl asked, entering my office. I motioned for him to close the heavy oak door. I sat there, not looking at anything in particular, while he took his first sip of tea from the large cup Maggie had prepared for him when he arrived. Carl. I started to explain, but I had to stop and clear my throat. It was hard to swallow. The tightness in my throat felt as strong as the tension in my abdominal muscles, which caused pain. Carl, I'm afraid Laura is getting into something she'll regret later, I said slowly. I tried to choose my words carefully, not wanting to tell him directly that I suspected her of cheating. Damn it, Mark, he replied sullenly. Damn, I'm so sorry to hear that, he said. We both took a deep breath. Carl put his mug on the corner of my table and began to carefully examine his nails without saying a word. I didn't know what to say either. Well, he said after an uncomfortable silence, in general, we have everything we need to. Find out for sure. I may hire a couple of temps to free up our people for more intensive work. Can you give me Laura's approximate work schedule, cell number, computer logins, credit card numbers? Anything like that? I nodded. I was starting to balk at using in-house people to work on this case instead of bringing in someone from outside, but I quickly realized that Carl wanted the best people to work on it. Sighing, I leaned over to the edge of the table and pulled my briefcase closer. I spent a lot of time on Sunday copying account numbers and other information I knew he would need from Laura and I's documents. I asked Carl to register me as a paying client of the Information and Observer Associations. I planned to pay for the services of this unit from my personal bank account. This is a small thing, but this way the auditors will not suspect anything suspicious. We discussed ways to spy on my wife to find out where she goes, who she meets, and what they do. I felt guilty, and it was stupid. The pain of that last weekend, coupled with what I realized on Friday night that there was a steadily growing disconnect from Laura's affections, made it necessary. I needed to know something. Honestly, if Laura didn't do anything to harm our marriage, she will never know about my actions, and perhaps I will find a way to suggest that she go to a couples therapist to sort out her problems. But if she was doing something that a married woman shouldn't do, well, that was something I desperately needed to know about. By midday, Carl's staff had installed a listening device in Laura's Lexus, parked outside her downtown office. It wasn't difficult. My name was on the title deed, so I gave them the key. They installed a battery-powered microphone under the driver's seat. The signal from the small transmitter could be heard within a radius of up to 1.5 kilometers. The microphone itself was so sensitive that it could pick up whispers in a soundproof car interior. A GPS transmitter was hidden in a hidden corner of the trunk, which immediately began broadcasting the vehicle's location with an accuracy of several meters. Carl assigned 7 of his best employees to this task and 5 surveillance machines. All cars and vans were hired and thoroughly checked by our own mechanics to ensure they didn't fail at the most inopportune moment. Another girl, a freelancer with excellent references, applied for a job at the accounting firm where Laura worked and expected to start next week. Carl told me to relax and let him take care of everything. He already had procedures in place for such situations and advised me not to intervene for now. This only depressed me more. If Laura really is cheating, it's so commonplace that there are already standard procedures for it. He also said that I have a choice. If they find out about the upcoming meeting, they may try to sabotage it, if my goal is to prevent it. Or we can collect as many photos and videos as possible for the divorce. I chose to prevent any possible meeting. I didn't have to think about it for long. I wanted my wife back. Carl nodded and asked me not to disturb Laura's usual routine. When the time comes to make a decision, he will let me know. Instead, I reported. That night, I called him from the basement after listening to the wiretapped phone calls. The information obtained in this way was illegal, but we did not intend to use it in court. Carl answered on the second ring. "Carl?" I asked. My voice was hoarse with emotion, and he sensed it immediately. "Oh shit," he said. "What's happened?" His voice was full of concern. I took a deep breath and held it to control myself. "Do you remember those interceptions of mobile and landline phones that I asked you to install when we were building the house?" I asked. "Yes, sorry, we didn't have time to connect the equipment for remote listening today, but—" "Oh, I understand, Carl," I said. "We only have 26 hours in a day, right? Don't worry." Anyway, Carl, I intercepted Laura's conversation with some guy named Brian at about 7 o'clock this evening. You can listen to it yourself tomorrow. But this Brian guy was talking about how he was going to have sex with Laura again, to quote the bastard. I wanted to cry, but I didn't allow myself to. I couldn't stop the cold lump forming in my stomach. My body seemed to become wooden, as if I were surrounded by massive layers of cotton wool, muffling all sensations. My heart hurt. I couldn't breathe. Laura was having sex with another man, and I didn't know why. I couldn't understand what I did wrong, why she decided to commit treason, betraying me and our daughter. I had a hard time swallowing the lump in my throat. "Well, Carl," I said when I had regained some control, "this changes our approach. I'll call Pete tomorrow morning and start the process of divorcing Laura. So now we need to gather as much evidence as possible." Pete is Peter Robinson, our full-time corporate lawyer and also my personal lawyer. "Yes, Mark," Carl said slowly. "Looks like that's all we can do." "Damn it, Mark. I'm just so sorry. I don't even know how to put it into words." "Yes, I know, Carl," I answered, my voice strengthening a little. "Thank you, buddy. But this is on Laura's conscience. It's her fault. I have a daughter who will just be devastated. She and I are victims, and I don't understand why Laura did what she did." I concentrated not to continue playing the role of the suffering husband for more than that one moment. "Okay? Well, I just wanted you to know that we're going in a different direction from now on," I told him. "See you in the office tomorrow morning, okay?" "Of course, Mark," he agreed. "Listen, try to spend this evening calmly, okay? Don't do anything you'll regret, boss," he said with obvious seriousness. I knew he was warning me not to do anything to physically harm my wife. "I'm fine, Carl," I told him. "I listened to this interception 3 hours ago and have already digested it." I was silent. "But I'll tell you one thing, Carl. I won't sleep with her tonight or any other. I'll come up with some excuse, but I won't sleep with the woman who stabbed me in the back. Both figuratively and literally. There are things I can handle and things I can't. I know this will complicate the investigation, but I just can't." My voice trembled at the last words, but Carl did not pay attention to it. "It's okay," he reassured me. "It may take a little longer, Mark, but those who cheat always think that they are smarter than others. They are confident that they can hide their infidelity from their spouse and from the rest of the world, and they do not even suspect how predictable their actions are and how easy it is to trace them." I was silent. "Well, hang in there, boss," Carl continued. "This will all end, and no matter what the outcome, you will come out of this stronger than you were, got it?" "One way or another, yes, I'll go out," I answered, but I didn't believe it myself. All I saw in front of me was a black hole full of suffering and humiliation for me and for my daughter. I hadn't even started to think about how this would break her heart. "Okay, Mark, call me if you need anything, okay? Call even if you just need to talk," he said. I said I would call and pressed the end call button on my cell phone. I turned on the interception equipment again to catch any further conversations between my dear wife and whoever she was cheating with. I spent that night in the guest bedroom down the hall, telling Laura that I had a dry throat and congestion that would probably cause me to snore heavily. She quickly agreed without comment. In addition, I told her that this way I would be closer to Alice if she suddenly called us at night. The fact that our daughter had wet her bed a couple of times last week was news to Laura, but she just shrugged and went back to her magazine. What I thought was a clear sign of an emotional problem in our daughter made no impression on Laura. The next day, Carl brought me a preliminary report. It turned out that Laura's lover was Brian Collier, one of the heads of the accounting department in her office. He was one of 3 department heads like Laura. He was married and had 2 children, a 9-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl. His wife's name was Pamela, and she worked part-time as an insurance agent in an office on the other side of town. Brian was 38 years old, a little taller than me, but much slimmer. I used to train as an amateur boxer with golden gloves in my teenage years and started weightlifting at that time to improve my upper body and leg endurance. I quit boxing when I went to college, but still went to the gym twice a week. Mr. Collier, judging by one photograph that Carl had already managed to obtain, was more of a runner if he played sports at all. I didn't know what women found attractive, but I guessed that the average woman might find him attractive, although not particularly attractive. Overall, I wasn't impressed with it. I wondered what it was about him that attracted Laura so much that she decided to ignore our wedding vows and meet this guy for sex. Carl obtained the complete history of Laura's phone calls over the past 2 years by bribing an acquaintance at the telephone company, and some of his people have already begun to analyze them. Initial analysis showed that at first calls between them were rare and occurred with long interruptions. However, less than 6 months ago, the calls started happening weekly and then became daily. Now they call each other 2 or 3 times a day, usually in the evening or early morning. Carl knew exactly what time I left for work and told me that Laura talked to Brian almost every morning after I left home. Laura almost always started the evening calls, most likely when I was busy and couldn't hear. This may have happened while I was in the basement lifting weights, while my daughter was usually nearby entertaining me. The timing just coincided with my training. "Is there anything you can remember that could explain the sudden increase in calls?" asked Carl. He was extremely professional, and I appreciated that. This made it a little easier for me to perceive everything that was happening. I leaned back in my chair and even put my feet on the corner of the table. Seeing that I had relaxed a little, Carl did the same on the other side of the table. Suddenly, it dawned on me. About, this may not be related, but about a couple of weeks before, Laura went to a seminar in Chicago organized by a company that hired her firm to audit their financial statements, I said uncertainly. I started to remember more details. "You know," I said, but stopped when a fragment of a memory surfaced in my memory, which gradually became a clear image. "I was driving Laura to the airport then," I said slowly, "and this guy was there too, boarding the same plane. I remember it like now." "Okay," Carl said confidently. "I will instruct my people to continue to look for other leads, but it seems to me that this seminar was the beginning of this whole story. There are too many factors pointing to this." I nodded. I didn't believe in coincidences either. Carl checked his notes. "That's all for today, boss," he said. "We received electronic copies of all transactions for the past year from the credit card issuers. It helps that you and Laura have joint accounts on all cards. Oh, that reminds me. We'll be checking your bank statements today to see if there's anything there. I'll let you know what we find, okay?" I was impressed by the volume and depth of information collected. They only worked on the case for 2 days. "How did you get all this without my permission?" I asked. I wondered if I should scandalize the banks and phone companies for sharing personal information so easily. Carl chuckled. "You have resolved everything," he said. I raised my eyebrows in a questioning gesture. He chuckled. "Boss, you have no idea what you're signing when Maggie puts a stack of documents in front of you, do you?" I smiled and nodded. The smile disappeared from my face. I used to say that I trusted Maggie almost as much as I trusted my wife. Now Maggie took first place. "Okay, okay," I said, raising my hands in surrender. "Go and fight the bad guys. And girls," I told him. By Thursday, Carl and his team had collected a huge amount of information about my wife and her new sexual partner. 2 investigators were sent to Chicago, and they had already found half a dozen people at the company that organized the seminars who remembered Laura and Brian as very close. One of the administrators, who witnessed most of their antics, initially thought they were married until he noticed that they had different last names. 3 or 4 other people at the hotel where Laura and Brian stayed recalled that they frequented the bar where they drank significant amounts of alcohol. Apparently, they barely made it to the elevator and went up to one of the rooms in the early morning. The bar manager twice asked them to behave more decently. 2 of Carl's investigators said they were in talks with the hotel to see if CCTV footage from that period was still available and could be obtained for a reasonable fee. Carl explained with a smile that this was a euphemism for a cash bribe for videotapes. I nodded. I understood this from his intonation. His freelance operative had been called into Laura's office for a temporary assignment much sooner than expected and had already reported that Brian and Laura were the office's couple. Apparently, their mutual boss knew about this and repeatedly admonished them not to bring their relationships into the workplace. Laura was said to have already lost a raise due to a poor performance report based on her behavior. I noted this in my memory. My lawyer would be interested to know about a firm that does not take serious steps to stop obvious violations of moral standards written into employee contracts. The freelancer worked in the accounting department and had already received copies of Laura and Mr. Collier's pay slips, as well as time and attendance records. The dynamic couple seemed to miss 1 or 2 days a week of dating. The credit card data Carl received from our bank showed where this was happening. It turned out that Brian Collier was also a miser, since Laura was paying for most of the rooms in an economical motel on the outskirts of the city. To me, this symbolized how cheap and tasteless this novel was. They couldn't even meet in a decent hotel in the city center. The small group of friends that Laura spoke of when she went out in the evenings consisted mostly of single and recently divorced women, apparently hunting for men. Laura pressured them to keep the secret, but all but one woman named Katie quickly gave Carl's investigators plenty of details. $100 was enough to get the dates, locations, and even approximate hours of Laura and Brian's meetings, which were portrayed as casual. Lately, even this fiction has been discarded. Most of the girls haven't seen Laura for 2 months. Katie almost immediately called Laura and told her that she had been questioned by a strange man about her connection to the group. She assured Laura that she had not told anything. Katie was furious. She thought it was unfair, malicious, and cruel of me to spy on her friend Laura. She was right in assuming it was me. I was the logical suspect, of course. Katie had plenty of experience with this sort of thing. So far, Katie's partial background check has revealed that she has been divorced twice. Once because she caught her husband with his secretary, and the second time because her new husband caught her with a plumber. Over the past few years, Katie has been moving from one man to another. On 2 occasions, she was named as a co-defendant in divorce cases where she specifically seduced married men. How this woman ended up in the same company as my wife, although she did not even work in the same building, remained a mystery. It seemed that Katie was, at least in part, encouraging the affair simply because she could. We also knew that the $100 bribes had worked so far because Carl had cloned Laura's phone. The other girls answered Laura's panicked calls just as confidently as Katie. Laura didn't even think that they could give her away. So all Laura knew was that someone was asking questions, but all her friends were keeping her secret, so she thought. I was again amazed at the amount and quality of information that Carl's operation had collected in such a short time. Of course, Brian and Laura were absolute amateurs, and Carl was a top-level professional. Brian and Laura didn't stand a chance. The house was quiet for the rest of the week and the next 2 weeks. Laura canceled all evenings except Friday, and Carl's agents confirmed that the ladies went to several clubs, danced a little with whomever they had, and then all went home. Brian was an obedient boy and stayed home with his wife and children. One report noted that Brian's wife was not happy with his presence at home and more than once expressed her suspicions about her husband's sudden change in habits. I was surprised that the effect of interrogating the girls from the company was so short-lived, but Laura and Brian probably had something of an arrogance towards me. After all, they lasted so long. However, less than 3 weeks after investigators spoke with the Friday night partygoers, the number of intercepted phone calls began to rise again. A couple of unfaithful spouses decided that everything had calmed down and that I had decided that nothing was happening. During this period, I almost completely moved into the guest bedroom. I could barely bring myself to kiss Laura on the cheek when I returned home in the evening, and I certainly had no intention of having sex with her. She hinted at desire several times, but I ignored her. I read every book in her small library to Alice and bought even more to read with her. I worked through my hoarse, dry cough, and Laura didn't question why I was sleeping separately. Laura didn't even suggest that I stay away from a child with such a cough. Meanwhile, Carl and his team noticed that the number of late-night phone conversations between Laura and Brian had increased dramatically. On Wednesday of the third week, Laura and Brian agreed to meet at their usual cheap motel. Carl kept everyone on standby to catch the traitors red-handed, and Pete, my lawyer, gave me detailed instructions on how to behave. I agreed with a little frightened by my protests that evening and suspicious questions to Laura's friends a few weeks ago. Brian and Laura were now driving around the city without a specific goal, trying to make sure that no one was following them. We knew this thanks to the GPS devices installed on both cars. In fact, no one was watching them. Carl already knew about the motel reservation almost immediately after it was made because the hotel manager was paid several $100s to tell us about it. Since we knew where they would arrive, there was no point in tracking. Although, if we didn't know their ultimate goal, Carl would have used half a dozen cars to drive along parallel streets and keep an eye on them. But with GPS sensors installed in cars, Laura and her lover would never have seen that someone was following them. After a while, Laura and Brian almost simultaneously drove up to the motel and parked in front of room 113. In this motel, all the rooms had separate exits to the street, so a couple of lovers only had to get out of their cars and walk a couple of steps to the door. None of them noticed the dark van across the road. They didn't know that their every move was being recorded on a high-quality digital camera. Laura and Brian hugged each other and kissed deeply, pressing their bodies against each other. Carl watched me carefully. He knew that more than anything I wanted to jump out of the room and start a showdown. "Mark," he said quietly, "this is going to get a lot worse before this is over. Are you sure you can handle it?" I sat down again on one of the two beds and licked my suddenly dry lips. "Do you have anything to drink?" I asked. He misunderstood my question and shook his head. "No, but I think you should take this," he said, handing me a small yellow pill. "This will help calm your nerves," he added softly. I took the pill and then took out a soft drink from the cooler, which, as it turned out, he had brought with him after all. Carl managed to install one high-quality digital camera directly in the room, hiding it in the air conditioner vent. The camera shot in full color and had a full range of motion in an arc of 160 degrees left and right and 85 degrees up and down. Plus, it had a 25x zoom that could pick out even a hair on the nose of one of the two. Not that Carl thought it was necessary. As soon as the couple walked inside, the show began almost immediately. In addition to the camera in the ventilation, Carl brought two fiber optic snake cameras. One of them slipped under the door to Laura's room and the second above the door. These chambers were less than a quarter of an inch in diameter and only a few inches long. They easily fit through the gaps between the door and the jamb, leaving the transmitter and antenna outside. Once the cameras were in place, their transmitters were taped to the outside wall. In the darkness, the dark-colored spy devices were invisible from more than a couple of feet away. To make them even less noticeable, the guys unscrewed the only outside light bulb that could illuminate the area before returning inside. The receivers were already connected to monitors and recording equipment, and we got ready to watch. It was assumed that if one camera missed something, the other two would accurately record everything. However, it wasn't a particularly exciting show. "Damn," I said after a minute of watching. This bastard is no bigger than me, I said indignantly. What the hell? My self-esteem was partially restored a little later, fortunately. I noticed Sherry, one of Carl's agents, looking at my crotch sometime later. She glanced at the monitors and shook her head. She smiled. It seemed to me that something like curiosity flashed in her eyes. We both turned away. She worked for me, and I wasn't going to mess things up in my own backyard, as they say. She was cute, though. Maybe one day she will stop working for me. Soon I will have room for someone next to me. After a while I left. There was nothing more to see. There was no fantasy in Brian's actions. It was all depressing. What did Laura see in this guy, and why did she ruin a 6-year marriage for something like this? The lovers did not meet for a week, and this greatly irritated them both. Their schedules, to their disappointment, couldn't match up, and they didn't know what to do about it. One day, Katie asked Laura to go with her to Las Vegas the following weekend. Carl's investigative team has already compiled an extensive dossier on Katie. They dug up a mountain of information on her. Katie turned out to be an extremely angry woman. Friends knew her as a bitter person, estranged from her parents and siblings due to past infidelities. In a telephone conversation that Katie and Laura didn't realize was being bugged, Katie elaborated on her previous idea. She wanted Laura to tell me that Katie had won 2 free tickets to Vegas in a radio contest and invited Laura to go with her. It was clear to everyone who heard the recording of the conversation that Katie proposed going alone with Laura to Sin City. Simply put, the purpose of the trip was to sleep with as many men as possible. Laura quickly agreed, but immediately questioned Katie's plans by inviting Brian along. When Katie found out about this in a subsequent phone conversation, she was clearly unhappy that Brian would be joining them in Vegas. However, she did not protest. Apparently, Brian had to pay for the trip out of his own pocket. He wasn't too happy about this either, judging by the irritated tone of his last call before leaving. I couldn't help but think what a cheap bastard he really was. He really believed that Laura should pay for his trip so he could have sex with her. Incredible. Pete, my lawyer, said he would add Katie to the list of people who would need to be served with a subpoena. She knew very well, and for a long time, that both Laura and Brian were married. In fact, she acted as the instigator of this scandal by inviting Laura to spend the weekend in Vegas. Pete didn't think Kathy would have enough money to recover anything from her, and he doubted the suit would get very far in civil court, but he was going to give her a good scare, as he put it. After this, she will never, ever again decide to destroy anyone's marriage. We discussed whether to stick with the materials collected at the motel or wait until their planned trip to Vegas. I was inclined to stop all this deception, lies, and betrayal right now and immediately file for divorce from Laura. Pete thought they should be given a little more rope so they can hang themselves, as he put it. A trip to another state with a bunch of lies and falsifications associated with it will be their final death. This will hit Laura especially hard if she shows clear disrespect for her marriage vows. Lawyers love to express themselves beautifully. In fact, Pete wanted Laura to go as far as possible and do something that would definitely be impossible to forgive, and he succeeded. Investigators were already at the same casino hotel where Katie, Brian, and Laura were staying. They settled in one of the towers, while Charles and 5 of his men rented a room in another tower, which had a direct visual field of view to the room where the 3 traders were staying. It cost us $500 to have the front desk clerk assign Laura a room in the right part of the building where she could easily be seen. Carl's operative said that the $500 disappeared from the counter faster than anyone could notice. Just a few seconds of work on the computer with reservations, and the job was done. The clerk probably decided that this was the easiest money in his life. Just a couple 100 feet from Laura's room, the 3 cameras that Carl had installed to record everything that happened in the room across the street were already at the ready. He said there was a good chance they would film something. In his experience, people in high-rise buildings subconsciously feel that their height and apparent distance from other buildings gives them the illusion of invisibility. This was confirmed more than once in practice, according to him, in the cases he led. Even if they had closed the curtains, Carl had a laser device that could pick up the smallest vibrations in the window from the sounds in the room. Of course, we would not have received a video recording, but a high-quality audio recording of the conversations would be sufficient for the court. Carl said the device was developed during the Cold War and was used by Russian and Western intelligence agencies to spy on each other. It was also planned to record telephone conversations. I had to call Laura and make one last attempt to persuade her to give up cheating and come back to me. From a legal point of view, it was just a pre-arranged scene, but deep down I hoped for success. I felt waves of heat and cold rolling through my body. Conflicting emotions raged inside me. I didn't know what I was feeling, except for one thought. I was in pain. I felt sick even though I hadn't eaten anything all day. Carl and his men left me at home, but I could see everything perfectly through the cameras they installed. The detective who followed them reported that during the flight, they practically exhausted the flight attendant by constantly ordering alcohol. They were already drunk. "Laura," I said into the phone. On the webcam, I saw Laura having sex with Brian. Katie participated too. "What?" Laura answered sharply into the telephone receiver. Hearing my voice, she pulled away from Brian and Katie. "Laura," I said again, "please, honey, don't have sex with, this person." I almost said his name. I needed to be more careful. Laura wasn't supposed to know that I knew who he was. I couldn't let her know she was being followed. "Come home to me, please," I said pleadingly, trying to make my voice as gentle and convincing as possible. These words were part of my lawyer's plan. They had to confirm Laura's complete infidelity and indifference. "Laura, please think about Alice. Think about what the destruction of our marriage will do to her." It's amazing how long a person can hold on to hope, even when he sees something beautiful crumble before his eyes. I loved Laura. I hoped to see even the slightest reason for hope, but there was none. I may still have loved her. I haven't learned to stop loving her, but at that moment I definitely couldn't stand her. Laura finally confirmed this feeling. "Fuck you," she shouted into the phone. "I already told you, you stupid freak. I don't sleep with anyone, and I'm sick of your suspicions." I could only shake my head at her duplicity. How can she say that and continue having sex as soon as I hang up? I was amazed at her hypocrisy. Laura was silent for a few moments. "But I'll tell you what, honey," she finally said in a confidential tone. "Maybe I'll go outside and pick up some guy right there on the street and bring him to my room. How do you like that, dear? Will you like it? After all, I will do this only so that you will finally be right at least once in your life. How do you like that, darling?" I was taken aback by the anger in her voice. This is the same woman who just a year ago wanted me to hold her all night after her beloved aunt died. I knew Laura as a soft, cozy presence in my bed, as someone I could turn to with any problem, and as a welcome lover when our daughter fell asleep. "Laura," I said hesitantly, "I don't know what else to say. I don't understand why you're ruining our lives. Think about what it will do to Alice, for God's sake." Laura interrupted me with another piercing scream. "Go to hell and take Alice with you," Laura yelled. She was almost unintelligible. It was only because I saw her face on the screen that I was able to make out her words. "When I get home, you bastard, we'll discuss all of this, understand? And you will be happy if I don't leave you the fuck. Do you understand me?" She continued yelling into the phone. Her hand reached for the end call button, and she threw the phone on the bed. The device bounced and fell between the bed and the wall. Laura staggered back to the bed and motioned for Brian to get back into action. He obeyed. On Sunday morning, Carl and his team shut down the operation, dismantled all the equipment, and sent it home. Tired, they boarded the plane and slept all the way home. We literally had more information in the form of videos, photographs, telephone transcripts, and financial analysis than my lawyer could handle. The volume of information stunned Pete for a while. He was planning to file divorce papers around noon on Monday. He will then have about 6 months to review all the materials before the state automatically approves the divorce. One of the most immediately useful pieces of material was a video of my wife having sex with a strange man while screaming insults and curses at me on the phone. The video was filmed through an open window. What can be seen with the naked eye can be recorded as evidence. To this, we added CCTV footage from my home, which showed scenes confirming Laura's indifference to Alice's well-being. In one of them, Laura is seen leaving the house, and Alice runs up the stairs after her, hoping to catch up with her. In other episodes, Laura is rude to her daughter for no apparent reason, and in one of them she tells her that Alice should prepare her own breakfast because she, Laura, does not have time. All of these materials were collected and submitted to the judge early Monday morning. She immediately issued a temporary order granting me full custody pending further proceedings in family court. Another order prohibited Laura from approaching the child until a family court judge heard the case. There were also other requests that the court granted with virtually no questions asked. Miracles happen when you have money and influence. In fact, I was helping my lawyer become even richer. Monday mornings are never a good time in an accounting firm. There were some of the employees who liked to drink, and some of them started the party on Friday night and didn't finish until Sunday. The rest of the staff preferred to sit lazily at their desks or chat over coffee until the partygoers came to their senses. When a large man in a gray suit entered the office just after lunch, several women noted his arrival expectantly, but he showed no interest in them. He kept glancing at the photograph in his hand, looking at the faces of every woman he passed. A few minutes later, he found the one he was looking for. He stopped in front of her as she spoke quietly to a tall, middle-aged man and a short, frail man who stayed close to her. The woman was clearly unhappy with this and tried to move away from him. Her eyes were dark and full of worry. She tried her best to concentrate on what her boss was saying. "Laura Archer?" asked the man's loud, deep voice. He came up from behind, and no one noticed his approach. The woman turned and nodded. She was clearly upset. Something was pursuing her. It was visible on her face. She looked at the man as he pulled a thick envelope from his inside pocket. "You, madam, have been served with a summons," he announced in a thunderous voice. He paused to make sure he had everyone's attention. Placing the case on the nearest table, he began to take out documents printed on thin paper backed with blue cardstock. "This is a copy of the divorce petition filed this morning. Mr. Mark Archer intends to divorce you as soon as possible," he said, handing her another set of papers. "And this, madam, is a court order prohibiting you from coming within 300 meters of the residence you previously shared with Mr. Archer," he continued, placing another set of documents in Laura's hands. "This is an interim order prohibiting you from contacting Mr. Archer's daughter, Alice Riog Archer, for any reason. You may not call, email, write, or otherwise attempt to contact Miss Archer. Is that clear, madam?" he asked. Laura nodded silently. She didn't know what else to say. The horror on her face was visible to everyone. By that time, a crowd of people had gathered around. "Mr. Archer would also like you to know that all of your joint credit cards were canceled 2 hours ago. Your joint bank accounts with your ex-husband have also been closed. That's 50% of the total amount in the former joint accounts," he said, picking up the cashier's check by the corner with disgust, as if it was stained with something, and adding it to the stack of papers Laura was holding. "Mr. Archer also asked me to inform you that your belongings and clothes are currently being packed and will be loaded onto a truck that is already approaching your former home. All your belongings will be placed in storage and will be available to you whenever and wherever you want. You can communicate your wishes to Mr. Archer's lawyer at the number provided," he added, holding out a business card. "You are prohibited from entering the home you previously shared with Mr. Archer for any reason, and he asks you to inform me that all the locks have been changed and the codes from the security system have been changed," the man said, looking at the sobbing Laura without a drop of pity. He then looked around the room and noticed a short man trying to leave unnoticed. "Mr. Gulcho Collier," he boomed, "don't be in such a hurry." Taking another envelope from his briefcase, he handed it to Brian, who reluctantly took it in his hands. "Sir, you have been served with a summons," he noted dryly. "Congratulations," he added. "You are named as an accomplice in Archer v. Archer." The man pulled out another stack of stapled documents from the case. You are also a defendant in a civil lawsuit filed this morning by Mr. Archer for willful and malicious interference with the marriage between Mark Archer and Laura Archer by having a dirty, disgusting, vile affair with the former Mrs. Archer. Brian turned pale and grabbed the table to keep from falling. My lawyer didn't think of this lawsuit. The man in gray turned to Laura's boss. When he saw him, he approached him to serve him with notice of a lawsuit seeking damages for the company's failure to comply with the morality clauses written into the contracts of all mid- and senior-level employees. The senior vice president, who had been aware of the problem from the beginning, also received a subpoena from the executive offices. Watching from the background, I felt almost nothing. I was cold, my face was frozen in stern, merciless features. I stood silently near the door through which the bailiff entered. I paid him an extra fee to hand Laura the check and everything else. In fact, it was not his responsibility. I saw the realization that she had completely ruined her life begin to sink in for Laura. As she collapsed to the floor, I turned around and walked out through the wide doors. I watched my soon-to-be ex-wife enter the dark paneled conference room. I sat at the head of a long table near the windows. The bright sunlight left my face in shadow, and she squinted, trying to make sure it was me. I sat in the big executive chair, leaning back and pretending to be calm when I was far from it. But I knew how to hide it. I've trained many times. I wanted to see you before the lawyers attacked me, Laura said hesitantly. She pulled out a chair a few steps away from me and sat down. It's been almost 4 months since she lost her job and went to live with her brother. Her brown hair almost reached her shoulders again. She cut it off when she got a job at an accounting firm, thinking it made her look smarter and projected the image of a professional woman. She had lost weight and had difficulty moving. She seemed to be eating and sleeping poorly. There were dark circles under the eyes. My heart sank with pity for her, but I didn't let it show. In such a personal situation, I put on the mask of a corporate CEO, a face that I usually showed only to subordinates and business partners. This face was often relentlessly merciless. "And here you are," I said quietly to my wife. She nodded without looking at me. Finally, she had to look straight into my eyes. "Mark," she said softly, "I want to start by saying that I am very sorry for what I did to you and our little daughter." I said nothing. I understand that this is not enough, and this will not make up for the pain I caused you, but these are the only words I have, she whispered. "I suffer too, Mark," she said. "I can't understand why I did what I did, and it's driving me crazy." She didn't say anything else for a long time, and I broke the silence with a comment. "I don't agree," I said calmly. "You haven't started to suffer yet, Laura, until you have to explain to a 3-year-old child that his mother may never return home." Laura burst into tears, quietly sobbing. "It's been 4 months since I had to tell her this, Laura, and she still falls asleep crying almost every night. Only in the last few weeks have I managed to make her smile sometimes." I stopped and watched as Laura slumped in her chair, choking on tears. "She screams and attacks anyone who tries to keep her from coming to me if I have to leave her somewhere longer than planned," I said quietly. "She's afraid that one day I won't come back for her. Can you imagine what it's like for a little girl who's not even 4 years old, Laura? Can I?" I forced myself to sit back in my chair as Laura shook in another wave of sobs. "She's at the new daycare center right here on the company property," I told her. "I built it so that I would never be more than a few minutes away from her. Anything longer than that makes her hysterical if she can't get to me." I watched as Laura continued to cry. "But on the other hand," I said, much more cheerfully than I felt, "the productivity of the single parents working here has increased, and the kindergarten has almost paid for itself." It didn't bother her. I let the silence fall. "Why?" I asked, as softly as possible. "Why did you do this, Laura? I loved you more than my life, and you tore my soul apart. Now there is a huge emptiness in me, and I can't even begin to fill it until I find out why you did this." She just shook her head, and tears began to flow down her cheeks again. I noticed that she wasn't wearing makeup. She probably expected tears. She was still beautiful, perhaps even more beautiful at 30 than she was when we got married. My heart broke watching her cry. I wanted to give up and cry too. I lost my younger brother in a car accident when I was a teenager. I was miserable then, but today I felt even worse, and I didn't know how to fix everything, just as I didn't know then. I didn't know if the pain would heal this time. I don't know why, she said after a long time. I think I might have gone crazy or something. She fell silent. I can't undo what I did, Mark, she said quietly. I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I won't ask for it, she whispered. I caused such terrible pain to the only man I can love. I will carry this burden for the rest of my life, and I don't know what to do about it. I want to die when I look back at everything I did to my sweet daughter. When I remember that night and hear myself screaming at you to take her to hell with you. She fell silent and threw her head back, staring at the ceiling. Tears flowed in an endless stream. I almost grabbed the remote control to turn on the DVD player in the corner. I knew which fragment on the disc was the scene where this woman, drunk and naked, cursed her own daughter. But it seemed unnecessary, so I didn't do it. She seemed to know this well enough already. After a while, her tears stopped. It seemed to me that she was too dehydrated to continue crying. I put the remote control in the top drawer of the nightstand nearby. I'm seeing a psychologist, she said slowly. I'm trying to understand why I ruined our lives and hurt so many people. Her fingers intertwined like snakes. I went to see Stacy Collier, she said. I apologized for destroying her family. She was kind to me, Laura said thoughtfully. I don't know why. She stared at the pattern on the massive tabletop in front of her for a moment. Stacy told me that Brian almost always found a woman at work. She said she was used to it, but this time she was tired. She's divorcing Brian and moving on. She met a good man who loves her children and says he is the best thing that has ever happened to her. I knew that Stacy Collier was divorcing her husband and knew about the new man in her life. But I didn't know that Laura went to Stacy and apologized. The fact that she did this spoke of repentance and a willingness to accept responsibility for her actions. Something stirred inside me. Something, full of hope, poked its head out, wondering if there was a chance it could survive and grow. What does your doctor say? I asked. Laura glanced at me and immediately returned her gaze to the surface of the table. We haven't made any progress, she admitted. I'd give anything to say we're making progress, but all I know is that something happened when I started drinking so much. Did they slip you something, Laura? I interrupted her. She looked up and looked me straight in the eyes for the first time during the meeting. I could not understand the emotions that changed on her face. I don't know, she finally admitted. Perhaps the first time. Perhaps the first time I had. Sex with Brian, I was very drunk. Her head dropped again. But there are no illegal substances. Sometimes I wasn't even drunk. Then, she said. Her tears began to flow again, but she clearly forced herself to stop sobbing. I wish I had that excuse, she added quietly, but I don't have one. I'm trying to figure out the real reasons with my psychologist. She fell silent for a while, continuing only when I changed my position in the chair. Mark. I lifted my chin and raised my eyebrows as a question mark. Will you go to her? She wants to talk to you. But not what you think. She just wants to ask you some questions. She wants to ask questions and try to find what I myself cannot tell her. Laura's words came out like a torrent. She was trying to say everything before I started screaming, apparently. When? I asked calmly. Laura looked at me incredulously. Will you go? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. I shrugged. I'm still your husband, I said seriously. I will do everything I can to help you as long as it doesn't harm our child. I almost said, my child, but didn't. Hope flashed and flared in her eyes. I wanted to say something sharp so that she would understand that there was no chance, but I stopped. I was willing to consider any route as long as it was in the best interests of my little daughter. I loved Laura unconditionally. I still loved her. Love is not something that can be turned off like a water tap. but love could not overcome the deep sense of betrayal that I felt. But there was my daughter, and I couldn't forget about it. This was the trump card that covered all other cards. I was willing to do anything to help her become whole again. Tomorrow afternoon, Laura stammered. Isn't it too soon? I can call and see if she can reschedule if you want. Is 2 hours good for you? Tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock will be fine, I said. I'll come. Laura cried again, but behind the tears there was joy shining in her eyes. Thank you before, she began. I thought she might have meant darling, but I wasn't sure. Thank you, Mark, she said. She began to rise. It was like watching an old woman get up from her chair. Before you go, I said, I was tested for sexually transmitted infections, and all the tests came back negative. Have you been checked? She nodded. I always forced him to use protection, she said bitterly. For that matter, at least I did this right. I fell silent for a moment. Laura, I said as calmly as possible, do you have anything else you want to say about those long months of hell you put us through? She flinched at the phrase, but straightened up and looked me straight in the eyes. No, Laura said quietly. I told you that I was very, very sorry for what I did to you and Alice. I said I didn't know why I did it, and I said I couldn't even begin to ask for forgiveness. That's all I came to say. Oh yes, I also wanted to ask if you would go to Dr. Jameson, she added. I waited a few seconds, waiting to see if she wanted to add anything. She seemed to mentally check off every item on her list. Laura, come and sit next to me, okay? I asked. She sat down, turning her body towards me, folding her hands in her lap, waiting for me to say something else. When your lawyer asked if I would agree to a private meeting with you, Laura, I imagined different things. I thought you would scream and get mad at me like you did that night in Las Vegas. I stopped when she lowered her head. I remembered how shame appeared on her face almost immediately after those terrible words that she said. I tried to call you back, she said quietly. As soon as I realized what I had done, I was overcome with a sudden and complete feeling of guilt. For everything. I knew it. This was recorded on the surveillance tape that Carl brought back. Brian didn't get far before Laura pushed him away and rushed to look for her cell phone. Laura was crying, drunk, and naked, but the recording showed genuine feelings of shame and remorse for what she had done, and they could not be faked. Although it happened too late, it was true. I know, I said softly. When I heard yesterday that you wanted to apologize, I thought that you would say something like, it just happened, or it didn't mean anything, as I often heard on those TV shows about cheating husbands and wives. If you had said something like that, or tried to say that none of this was about me, or if you had said that you loved me and that you could fix everything, if you had said any of those things, I would have already sent you and 2 guards outside our office. Laura shook her head, sobbing again. I poured her a glass of cold water from a thermos and passed it across the table. She thanked me with a look. You didn't say any of that, and your mother told me that you never said anything bad about me to your family. She says that from the first day you took full responsibility for what happened when you returned to their home. Laura just spread her hands helplessly without saying a word. I took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. I was pretty sure I was going to make a serious mistake. This was a retreat, if nothing else, from the strong position I had taken in these negotiations. But I had a daughter who couldn't get rid of her nightmares, and I hadn't heard her joyful laughter for so long. If there was even a tiny chance of getting her back to normal, I had to try. And for myself, too. This huge emptiness inside me was slowly killing me. Laura, I said as softly as possible, there is a small bathroom through the door. I pointed to the small door on the side. Why don't you go and clean yourself up? She nodded, grateful that she wouldn't have to show her tear-stained face to the world without washing herself at least a little. Before she went far, I took a bottle of eye drops from the nightstand drawer and placed it on the table next to her hand. Here, I said when she stood up. Drop a little, it will help remove redness from the eyes. She nodded again gratefully. I took the phone and pressed the intercom button for the secretary on the first floor. Maggie? I said when she answered. Maggie, can you bring Alice from the Children's Center to Conference Room C? Yes, thank you, Maggie. I put the phone back down. Laura was halfway to the bathroom when she suddenly stopped and turned to me. Surprise was written on her face. She did not dare to believe what she heard. Laura, I said quietly, I would let you see her any time you asked. I would never separate you, don't you know that? She lowered her head. I felt too guilty for my words, and for the way I treated her, she admitted. I was afraid that I would start crying and wouldn't be able to stop. It wouldn't help her at all. She froze for a moment without saying a word. Are you sure this is normal? She asked softly. I looked into her eyes, trying to figure out if I was doing the right thing before Alice entered the room. I made the decision abruptly, trusting my instincts, as I usually did in business negotiations. She'll be here in a few minutes. Don't you think you should prepare to meet her? I said quietly. Laura began to cry again, but this time her tears were mixed with a smile. She turned around and hurried to the bathroom, trying to wipe away her tears with a napkin. I turned to the large window looking out into the bright sun as I waited for my daughter to be brought upstairs. Thank you for coming, Mr. Archer, said a well-groomed, formally dressed, but attractive older woman. Can I call you Mark? She asked. I shrugged. Can I call you Janice? I asked. I saw her full name on the office door outside. Surprised, she raised her eyes and looked me straight in the face for the first time. Before that, she was always looking somewhere over my right shoulder. I think I need to maintain a professional distance, she said. Therefore, if you don't mind, please call me Doctor. Her voice was calm and professional, so there was no offense. I nodded in agreement. Professional sounds good. For both of us, I said. She looked at me for a while, tapping her pen on the notepad on her desk. I looked back silently. Laura told me that you allowed her to see her daughter yesterday, she remarked. I don't think you understand how much this meant to your wife. I snorted. Doctor, don't talk to me as if I'm the village idiot, I said irritably. Without waiting for an answer, I continued. Of course, I know how much it meant to her, and I know how much it meant to our daughter, too, I added. The doctor looked at me with a somewhat puzzled look. Yes, she drawled, stalling for time. It was an important meeting for both of them. I hope you are going to allow them to continue meeting from time to time. I nodded. For now, I see that Laura is working on solving her problem, I answered directly. I told her yesterday, and I'm telling you today, Doctor. If she starts acting like she did for the last year again, I'll cut her off in a heartbeat. Dr. Jameson looked at me carefully. But then I'll probably have to take my little girl to the best psychiatrists in the country, I added quietly, because she and I will end up in hell. The doctor didn't say anything for a long time. You are a very insightful and interesting person, Mr. Archer, she said slowly. You have a toughness, a certain ruthlessness that I didn't expect, judging by Laura's descriptions. I believe you show one face in your professional life and another to your loved ones. She looked at me thoughtfully for a long time. The fact that you allowed Laura and Alice to meet and hoped that they could begin to heal together shows your deep affection and care for your family, she finally said. There didn't seem to be any question in her words, so I remained silent. Do you know that Laura loves you so much that she literally eats herself with guilt for what she did? The doctor suddenly said, hoping that I would lose my temper, and blurred out the answer. I looked at her calmly and was in no hurry to answer. Yes, I know that, I assured her. But love alone may not be enough to get through this, I objected. Do you understand that my daughter and I have too many deep wounds that have just begun to heal, and there is no guarantee that they will ever heal? I glanced at the therapist, perhaps a little defiantly. I began to get the impression that the doctor considered Laura a victim, and that I may have been the one who pushed her into the abyss where she lived for so long. Dr. Jameson looked at me with more sympathy than I expected. Yes, Mr. Archer, I understand that. Applying healing balm to these wounds is my job, she said quietly. And I hope to help you all come to terms with what happened and find a way to move past it so you can be a family again. I shook my head. Doctor, before we even think about getting over this, I need to know why this happened in the first place, I said. Laura hurt me so deeply that I don't know if I'll ever be a whole person again. And if I can't, we'll never be a family again. I looked closely at the doctor. I knew there was some challenge in my gaze. I was also tense. I allowed this woman, a psychologist, but still a woman, to see a little of my inner world. Given the events of 4 months ago with Laura, this could have been dangerous for my peace of mind. Is it that Laura had sex with another man, Mr. Archer? She asked. I shook my head. I have already realized that I will probably be able to survive the very fact of her betrayal. I will be able to place this man in the same corner of my consciousness where her previous 4 lovers are. I don't think that the betrayal itself is critical, I said. I paused to consider my words. The doctor opened a second notebook and flipped through its pages until she found an entry, which she studied with obvious interest while I remained silent. Doctor, I added, I'm much less concerned about the fact of sex than about the reasons why she had sex with him, I said quietly. Now it's the 21st century, Doctor. A man who doesn't meet a woman until his 3rd year of college doesn't expect his future wife to be a virgin. I looked into her eyes for a long time, wondering if I should add anything else. Have you seen 2 videos of her? Meetings with him? I finally asked. The doctor nodded. Fine. I wanted to invite you to watch them if you haven't, I said. You know, doctor, when you look at her having sex with this man, the pain subsides a little and does not intensify, I said slowly. It's unpleasant, it hurts, and it's a terrible insult to me that she shared herself with another man, but there's something ridiculous about it that somehow dulls the pain. I don't know what Laura thinks, but I found their sex rather primitive and boring, perhaps, not very inventive. Not at all what I would expect from an unfaithful wife willing to experiment. I paused, waiting for the doctor to decide if she should add anything. Laura told me to be completely honest with you, Mr. Archer, she finally said with a small smile that appeared on her face for the first time today. To use Laura's words, the doctor said, he was pathetic. I couldn't help but smile back in surprise, but the smile quickly faded. I don't understand. If she thought so, then why did she do it, doctor? I asked quickly. Mr. Archer, why Laura did what she did is going to be a very, very difficult question. At this point, I'm convinced that she really doesn't understand why this happened, she said slowly. Wait, doctor, I interrupted. It didn't just happen. It happened over and over again for 6 months. And that doesn't even include all the steps that led to her having sex with that pathetic one. All this developed over the course of about 6 more months before her infidelity began. It's not just one event, doctor. I understand that, Mark, she said softly. I didn't mean to downplay the significance of what happened. And Laura doesn't either, she leaned back, not taking her eyes off mine. What I'm trying to say is that the reason Laura did this probably doesn't come down to one clear, understandable explanation. It may turn out to be a complex tangle of various factors that converged at a single possible moment in time and provoked a catastrophe. The doctor suddenly leaned forward, lowering her head slightly to look me straight in the eyes. If this turns out to be the case, Mr. Archer, can you live with it? She asked, challenging. I don't know, doctor. What do you mean? Does Laura have some kind of mental disorder that led to this? She nodded, showing no emotion. It didn't help me at all. If they can explain this to me in understandable language, perhaps I can, I answered slowly. I'm ready to work on it. Dr. Jameson nodded curtly. From the look in her eyes, I could tell that my words satisfied her. But doctor, I added, raising my hand to stop her. I can't stand psychological bullshit, okay? I'm an engineer. I'm used to dealing with clear data, black and white, if you like. I will be very, very skeptical of any explanation of her actions if it turns out to be disguised in some complex terms and does not give me a final understanding of the problem. Dr. Merza, I fell silent for a moment. The point is that professional counselors allow silence to accumulate without feeling the need to fill it with words. I'm not talking about revenge, Dr. Jameson, although I have already done something. I said thoughtfully. I made sure Laura felt at least some of the humiliation she brought down on me. I made sure that the procedure for serving her with divorce papers was as public and indicative as possible for all her colleagues and acquaintances. I had to pay the bailiff $500 extra, but it was money well spent. I also got them both fired almost immediately. Laura loved her job, and I know it hurt her when she was fired so unceremoniously. In addition, I filed several lawsuits against her lover. If nothing else, he'll be financially ruined for the rest of his life just trying to pay legal fees, and probably give everything he has to his wife. I shared these videos with his wife, and she plans to use them to further humiliate her in her divorce proceedings. I fell silent again for a while. I won't hide it, Doctor. I enjoyed my revenge, and I enjoy telling you about it, I told her with a grin. That's why I insisted on becoming your patient too. I wanted to make sure that doctor-patient privilege applies to everything I tell you. My smile probably resembled that of a predator. Dr. Jameson pulled back slightly, almost imperceptibly, but I have learned to notice such nuances in body language. This is an invaluable skill in business negotiations. Now the doctor realized that I was not only merciless, as she said earlier, but also vengeful. This was one of my shortcomings. I learned to live with it. However, Doctor, I continued, I no longer have a strong desire for revenge. This Brian is broken and won't cause anyone any more problems. I knew that my face expressed satisfaction, but I did not hide it. As my doctor, she is required to keep almost everything a secret, including my boasts. She didn't need to know that I started a fund for Brian's kids to go to college. It wasn't their fault what happened, and I didn't want them to suffer. I know Laura is suffering too, I continued, whether it's because of my actions or her own feelings of shame for what she did. But there is no need to add to her suffering. No more needed. I was confused. The doctor asked me a question, and I still didn't give a straight answer. Doctor, I finally said, I want you to understand that if I take the risk and try to live with what she did again, if I try to suppress all this anger and humiliation, because Laura had some kind of emotional disorder or something else, then I will need some kind of guarantee that this will not happen again 6 years after our reconciliation. The doctor shook her head. I can't give you that guarantee, Mr. Archer, she said quietly. Nobody can. But what we can do is try to understand what caused this dramatic behavioral breakdown that Laura and I trace back to about 6 months before her first minor infractions, which then escalated into full-blown infidelity 9 months ago. We can make her aware of what affected her so deeply and find all the other factors that were layered on top of it at the same moment or a little later. If we can bring these problems to the surface, Laura can deal with them and leave them in the past. There are no guarantees. Philosophers and now scientists have been trying to understand how the human mind works for centuries, and in many ways we are no further along than when we lived in caves. But we can teach Laura, and you too, Mr. Archer, how to recognize the signs of emotional problems, how they may manifest themselves, and, most importantly, how to discuss them with Laura before you lose contact with each other again and end up in trouble. In the same terrible situation as now, the doctor took a deep breath. Emotional problems? What do you mean? I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. Okay, doctor, I said slowly, you've interested me. Are you saying there are some serious psychological issues involved? Not just, how should I put it, boredom, temper tantrums, and hormones? She shook her head slowly from side to side. Laura and I have been going over her life over the last couple of years, Mr. Archer, and unless she's lying to me, there were no signs of anything unusual before she started responding to Brian's attention. Laura views his behavior as a rather sophisticated seduction that began about a year before you caught her cheating. I've been in this profession for 26 years, Mr. Archer. When we see such drastic changes in behavior and attitudes, it means that something emotionally traumatic has happened. I nodded reluctantly. I couldn't say anything about her diagnosis. I accepted that she was an expert in her field. Carl's investigators also dug through Laura's and mine's entire history up to our wedding, looking for possible infidelity, and found nothing. What they found was almost exactly what the doctor had said. Laura had actually started cheating about 5 or 6 months before the cameras caught her with Brian Collier. Carl's investigators also collected enough evidence from Laura's former colleagues who confirmed that Brian had been trying to seduce her for months before she started sleeping with him. I was an engineer by training. I don't believe in coincidences. I could accept the doctor's explanation. I sat in silence for a long time, looking thoughtfully somewhere over Dr. Jameson's head. I didn't expect such a turn. Laura said she felt crazy, but I assumed that was just a way to avoid really confronting the reasons why she cheated on our marriage. I didn't even think that there could be some kind of emotional or psychological problems hidden behind her betrayal, and I couldn't decide for myself whether it was better that she might not have realized why she betrayed me and our daughter. "Okay," I finally said. The doctor looked up from her notes. All this time she was quickly writing something down in her notebook. Now she looked at me questioningly. "Doctor, you said that you are looking for a certain event that became a trigger. Let's say 4 months ago our life collapsed. 5, even 6 months before that she started sleeping with Mr. Pathetic. And another 6 months before that, I first noticed that she had become colder towards me. It turns out that something happened about 16 months ago, almost a year and a half ago." The doctor flinched slightly at my rude expression, but quickly recovered. "Yes, something like that," she replied. I thought for a while, thinking I knew the answer, but I was sure Laura had already told her. I couldn't think of anything else. "Doctor," I said slowly, not sure if this would be helpful, "did Laura tell you that her Aunt Ruth died around that time? Maybe a little earlier." Laura adored her aunt and was completely devastated by her sudden death. Dr. Jameson almost gasped. She shook her head. "No, she didn't tell me about that," she replied. A distant look appeared in her eyes. "Oh," she muttered. "Oh, God." I tapped my finger on the table to get her attention. "When she returned from the funeral, she cried for 3 days straight," I continued, trying to be helpful. "I took time off to be with her, but I couldn't help much. I just kept her close, tried to be close to her as best I could." The doctor nodded. She heard me, but was completely immersed in her thoughts. "Hey, Dr. Jameson, are you with us?" I joked, trying to get her attention back. She blinked and returned to the conversation. "Do you think her aunt's death might be an important factor, doctor?" I asked. She nodded vigorously. "Yes, and the fact that she didn't even remember about it says a lot, Mr. Archer," she said confidently. Suddenly, she stood up. "Mr. Archer, thank you so much for coming. It's time for us to wrap up, but I think you've given me a clue to a very important area to explore with Laura. I cannot yet say exactly what this means, but it is very promising, I assure you. Will you come again?" I nodded and handed her my business card, on the back of which I wrote my personal number. "Doctor, this is my personal number. Call anytime, day or night, if you need anything, and you will get it," I said. Dr. Jameson looked surprised. She was not used to receiving such instructions from someone. We shook hands, and I left. I didn't know enough to say whether Laura's infidelity could be explained by an emotional disorder, a problem, or an illness, or something else. Moreover, I didn't know if this would change anything in my heart. The facts remained the same. Laura betrayed me and our daughter, destroyed 2 marriages, and brought an enormous amount of pain into our lives. I wasn't sure anything could help me get over it. 2 months later. "Have you talked to Dr. Jameson about your Aunt Ruth?" I asked as I watched Alice run through the huge maze of thick hollow pipes suspended from the ceiling at Chuck E. Cheese's. I could only see her in rare moments when she ran past windows or clear plastic areas in pipes. The joyful cries of children playing on equipment specially designed for them created a background noise for Laura and I to talk, which, frankly, was quite convenient for me. We could talk calmly, but at the same time there was a feeling of some distance. "Yes," she said, loud enough for me to hear over the noise. "But I don't know why she wants to know about Aunt Ruth and Father," she added absently. She also watched Alyssa, slightly worried that the older girl seemed to be accompanying Alyssa through some areas. It was news to me that Laura's consultant was interested in her father. "What is this about your father and aunt?" I asked. She turned to me with a blank look. "What?" she asked. "You said Dr. Jameson was asking about your Aunt Ruth and your father," I replied. She shrugged and shook her head. "I'm sorry, I was watching our daughter fool around." "Mark," she apologized. "I don't know why I said that," she added. "She asked about Aunt Ruth, but we got nowhere. I'm really tired of talking about her." "I understand," I said. "After a long conversation with Dr. Jameson a couple of weeks ago, I have become more sensitive to what Laura says or does." "Aunt Ruth was your mother's sister, right?" Laura nodded. "Yes, Mom and Dad were in shock when Aunt Ruth had a stroke and died," she said. "Well, that's quite understandable, isn't it?" I asked. "Ruth lived with your parents for a long time, right?" I tried to recall vague memories. I didn't know her family well. We weren't close, although I liked them. "Yeah," Laura replied. She stood up and walked a few steps to better see how our daughter climbed out of the opaque part of the pipe. Alyssa paused a little before reaching the next transparent section of the hollow pipe, if she continued to run at the same speed as before. But she had nowhere else to go. I was sure that in a second or two we would see her. "Your parents were close to Ruth, right?" I suggested when she returned to me. "What? Oh yeah, pretty close," she replied. "When Aunt Ruth's husband died, she moved in with Mom and Dad. It was, 25 years ago, probably." Alyssa ran up with the other girl, a step behind. Her name was Terry, introduced by Alyssa, and she was almost 5 years old. Terry's parents waved from a nearby table, nodding as Alyssa offered Terry a slice of her pizza. Terry had a younger brother and a younger sister, both of whom were crying, and their parents had their hands full. Laura and I talked for another 45 minutes, while two little girls laughed and giggled while eating a surprising amount of pizza. I tried to understand who Laura is and what motivates her in every word she says. I looked for hidden meaning in every topic, in every conversation. It was tiring and annoying. I really wanted to vent my anger at what she had done, but Dr. Jameson had already told me unequivocally that Laura was suffering, or was suffering, I wasn't sure, from some kind of emotional breakdown. I didn't know what to do or how I should feel. Is it possible to be angry with a person with a mental disorder? It seems as pointless as punishing a baby for wetting his diaper. Neither of them control this process and are not responsible for it, right? Alyssa enjoyed everything that happened at the children's pizza restaurant, especially that she met another girl her age. As we were leaving, she was jumping across the parking lot holding the hands of Laura and me. When we dropped Laura off at her brother's house, Alyssa took it in stride, without the tears and heartache that had been there last week, the first time I'd ventured out together. I explained our separation to Alyssa the same way I explained when she had to go to her room if she was misbehaving. These were words that she understood, and they made sense to her. She was sad without her mother, but it was easier for her to accept it. When she asked what her mother did, I said that I don't tell others why she is sent to her room, and it would be fair not to tell her what her mother did. Alyssa didn't like it, but she let it go surprisingly easily. She fell asleep on the way home. The next morning, I called Dr. Jameson and asked if there might be any significance to the unexpected connection Laura had made between her father and her aunt during our conversation. As before, she said that anything Laura didn't want to discuss could very well be important. She promised to keep me informed of what she discovered in Laura's next session. 9 days later, Dr. Jameson bit her lip for a moment, wondering if she should say something to me. "Mr. Archer, on your first visit, you said that you, Laura, had already had sexual experiences with others when you got married, right?" I shrugged and nodded. I didn't see what this had to do with Aunt Laura's death. The doctor decided to go for it. She cleared her throat to stall for a little more time. "Well, Laura said I need to be completely honest with you. I just hope she remembers that tomorrow when we meet," the doctor said. Mr. Archer, what would you say if I told you that Laura didn't actually have two lovers before you?" My face must have shown my confusion. "Mr. Archer, but Mr. Archer, you were the first man she was with." I sat back, stunned for the first time in our conversation. I, I, Doctor, I don't know what to say, I protested. That night, damn, she was just as ready as I was. She wasn't too stiff or cold or anything. I don't understand, Doctor. I finally gave up. Because you had experience, you guided her through the entire process of a love relationship. Apparently quite easily and without noticing her inexperience, she said softly. Somehow she decided that her experience was important to you. She used, I have to be careful not to embarrass you, but she had experience using sex toys, but that's it, she finished. I stared at her with a blank look. But why did she think that way? And why never told me about it? I asked. Why would it matter? The doctor shrugged. We may never know, she replied. A casual remark, or lack thereof, a gesture. Impossible to say. Your wife told me about her inexperience and even found some irony in it. I think that although she has forgotten the original reason, it somehow affected her self-esteem at the beginning of your relationship. She mentioned it when we were discussing her affair with Mr. Pathetic. The doctor began to turn the notepad over in her hands. The thing is, Laura told me about it quite easily, she said. She didn't try to hide it. It was no longer a sensitive issue for her, at least not anymore. She twirled the handle in her hands for a few more moments. Mr. Archer, I hope I can explain this to you in a language that your life experience and training will allow you to understand. She looked at me carefully, trying to gauge my reaction. Sighing, she resolutely continued. Since we started, we'll continue, she muttered. Taking a deep breath, she stated the essence of the matter. I'm pretty sure that one of the reasons Laura began an affair with Mr. Pathetic was because she was trying to replicate the role she experienced with you at the beginning of your marriage. I have some indications that Laura was trying to teach O'Brien to be a better lover, although she wasn't very good at it. This role reversal seemed to be therapeutic for her and helped her get rid of the underlying problem. What's the problem? I asked. I knew there was a big frown on my face. Dr. Jameson tried to sound impersonal when discussing Laura's sexual relationship with Brian Collier, but I didn't feel as detached. I don't know for sure, she answered honestly. I think it was probably a deeply repressed resentment that you were directing her first sexual experiences. Laura, to put it simply, has a bit of stubbornness. And that, I believe, has to do with her relationship with her father. He seemed to be a rather distant, authoritarian figure, but also someone she loved like a little girl, almost to the point of adoration. I haven't even started moving in this direction yet. I opened my mouth, but the doctor raised her hand to stop me from commenting. It won't come right away, Mr. Archer, she warned. Sometimes we can, as they say, stumble upon a gold mine. On other days, there will be no progress at all. Moreover, some of the conclusions we have already drawn may turn out to be false. I don't know yet. This is not an exact science in the truest sense of the word, she said firmly. But couldn't she resolve this grievance with me? Couldn't she have mentioned it sometime and discussed it with me together? I asked. Oh, of course I could, Dr. Jameson replied, almost cheerfully. But only if she realized it. Instead, she took an extreme route to solve her problem, and she solved other issues along the way. Oh, I see you don't like that word, do you? She noticed how I winced. What about problems? Okay, let's use this. That brings me to a good question I wanted to ask you. Oh, damn, we only have a few minutes left. I'm sorry I couldn't reschedule our next meeting to give us more time, but I felt I needed to talk to you and update you. She pursed her lips and looked at me, searching for the right words. Mr. Archer, things are starting to get complicated. This will become confusing, and it will be especially difficult for you because I see that you have not yet completely let go of your anger about what happened. I understand that. Laura understands that. And I need you to recognize that in yourself too, okay? I nodded. I had already realized that I would have to suppress some of my own instincts while I tried to understand this idea that Laura had an emotionally disturbing problem. I was ready to go for it, but at the same time it offended me. I tried to look into my soul, but I could not, for the life of me. understand what I had done to deserve Laura's betrayal. However, it seemed that I was the one who was bending the most in this situation. However, I had to firmly keep Alyssa's well-being at the center of my actions. I will continue on this path for a while longer for her sake. Fine. I need you to remember that every time we talk, you are getting a simplified version of something that is actually much more complex. On your first visit, you asked me to explain everything to you so that the engineer could understand it right. I am trying to be faithful to your request, as well as Laura's request to be absolutely frank and sincere with you. I am not saying that you are not smart enough to understand all these many emotional crossroads and conflicts in the human mind, Mr. Archer. You just don't have any training in my field. Although I also consider myself smart, I don't have the slightest idea what, vectors and force and gravity and those things are, okay? You know what it is. It's part of your daily life. Your mind can understand such things, but mine cannot. Do you know what I mean? On the other hand, you are probably now thinking about how you could share a simple and understandable version of the definition of vector, right? I'm sure you could come up with a wording in a few seconds that my mind could process and use, right? But will this simple explanation be something that your fellow technicians and engineers can use in their work? No, I don't think so. Do you see where I'm going with this and why some things may never be fully understood? I snorted expressively and looked at Dr. Jameson with a grin. Okay, doctor, I said. You saved yourself with that last explanation. You know that, don't you? Young man, she replied with a deadpan smile. Why do you think you pay me so much money? 3 weeks later. Honey, I think you need to do this. You said yourself that you haven't made any progress with Dr. Jameson for several weeks, right? I could hit myself. I didn't plan to use a term of endearment. It just came out while I was trying to convince Laura to do something she didn't want to do. Somehow it turned out that convincing her to agree to a type of treatment that she did not like at all became my responsibility. Looks like I just had to smile and bear it. I did it, but I didn't like it at all. Laura looked up at me as we walked side by side through the grassy park. She bit her lip and a worried expression appeared on her pretty face. We walked close, but did not touch each other. But it feels so intrusive, she complained. I didn't like her capricious tone. For the first time in months, I took her wrist and turned her to face me. Her face immediately turned red. I knew my woman. It was a powerful moment for her. This casual gesture meant more to Laura than to me. I needed to make sure I wasn't giving her false hope. I looked around and found a picnic table under a tall poplar tree nearby. Releasing her wrist, I pointed to the inviting shadow under the tree. Look, Laura, I said as forcefully as I could. You're saying that you and the doctor agree that you haven't made any progress in trying to figure out the reasons. For what you did, right? She nodded. We approached the table. Laura sat on the bench, and I sat on the bench opposite, facing her. It was 15 degrees cooler in the shade under the tree. It's hot in Texas in the summer, and that's a fact. Then don't you think we need to start this process over again? Shouldn't we take advantage of every opportunity to get things moving again? Laura looked at the park with a worried expression on her face. The vast area of thick grass with small groves here and there was almost empty at noon on a weekday. We had as much privacy as we could want. I know, Laura finally said after a long pause, but it seems like putting me into a trance and delving into my mind is so dirty that I'm not sure I can do it. Look, Mark, I just don't think this is going to do any good. How can you know this? I objected. Laura winced at my tone and expression. She shook her head in protest. I just don't believe it will help, she responded defensively. She and I can talk a lot more. I'm not against it. I'm being as honest with her as possible, Mark. I was silent for a long time. Laura was stubborn and completely unreasonable. I had a long telephone conversation with Dr. Jameson in which she asked me to strongly encourage Laura to accept psychiatric hypnotherapy. She felt that Laura was unconsciously hiding something important behind layers of concealment and denial. The doctor believed that if she could bring this to the level of consciousness, Laura would be able to deal with it effectively. The doctor was sure that there were repressed memories, perhaps unpleasant experiences, or bitter disappointments hidden somewhere deep in the subconscious. She said that bringing these memories to the level of awareness would help Laura resolve her problems. I wasn't so optimistic, but it seemed like a logical step. Unless Laura was being deliberately evasive, I wondered what she might be hiding. Laura, I began slowly and carefully, I'm trying my best to support you with all this counseling and stuff. It's very difficult for me to do this if you don't do everything you can to explain to me why you fucking cheated on me for 6 months with this. I had to take a deep breath to suppress the anger that was just around the corner when I thought about her cheating. I tried again. I need to know why you invested so much time and energy into your lover at my and Allison's expense, I told her. Laura, if you leave this as it is, I will never have a complete understanding of everything that is happening. All I'll be left with is a nagging doubt that you simply picked some minor conflict from our past and turned it into an excuse for sex with another man outside of our marriage. And it won't work, Laura. Even if I was willing to put aside my humiliation and pain, this feeling, this doubt, would destroy us later. But we won't even get to that point, honey, because I'm not ready to ignore this humiliation and pain, Laura. If you don't take this step, you are choosing the end of our marriage, dear. I stopped and watched as Laura lowered her forearms onto the picnic table and dropped her head onto them, crying bitter tears. I tried to remain indifferent, but it was difficult. I almost told her that I would take her daughter too, but that would be cruel, not only to say, but to do. I kept this last trump card in reserve, but hoped that I would not have to use it. My daughter deserved better than to be a pawn in an adult game. After some time, her sobs subsided to rare sobs and then disappeared completely. She raised her head and looked at me with eyes full of tears. She nodded furiously. Okay, Mark, she said hesitantly. I'll do it. Her face expressed obvious suffering. That's good, dear, I said, this time not shy about using the term endearment. Will you come with me? She asked almost pleadingly. She held her breath and tensed her body, waiting for my answer. I didn't hesitate. Of course, I replied, smiling softly. Where else should I be? I asked her. She smiled and took my hand. We walked hand in hand to my SUV. It was much easier for me than I thought. A week later, Laura's marathon session with Dr. Jameson took place 3 days ago on Friday. I was there, as I promised Laura, but I was not allowed to be in the office. The doctors simply didn't allow it. One of the conditions of hypnosis was that the patient had to focus his attention on only one person, and if I were in the room, Laura would constantly seek feedback from me. It just wouldn't work, so I sat in the waiting room and tried to memorize the contents of the 16 magazines lying there. When I woke up, I couldn't turn my head to the right at all. Laura left the doctor's office, pale-faced and clearly shocked. She didn't want to talk to me. Neither she nor the doctor. This made me a little angry. I waited for 4 hours, and no one wanted to say a word. I knew that the doctor and Laura also met for a couple of hours on Saturday and briefly on Sunday, but I didn't know what they talked about. I was ready to get answers. Good morning, Mr. Archer, Dr. Jameson greeted him. She sat at her desk, leaning back in her chair, her hands resting on the armrests and her fingers clasped over her stomach. The doctor looked pleased, although Laura was much less happy to be there. Good morning, doctor, I replied in a neutral tone. I didn't know what awaited me, and I was tense. How are you doing? It's okay. It's okay, she replied. The doctor looked at Laura and smiled softly. Are you okay with what we discussed over the weekend, Laura? Laura nodded, but didn't show much enthusiasm. She had been silent and taciturn since we met downstairs in the hall. We took the elevator together. Dr. Jameson beamed at the two of us. Okay, let's get down to business, she said cheerfully. She looked at me for a long moment, and her smile faded slightly. Mr. Archer, she began slowly, how much does the engineer know about the subconscious? I shrugged. Over the weekend, I read everything I could on the topic of hypnosis and the difference between the subconscious and the conscious. Right brain, left brain, logic and emotions, that kind of thing. I learned that the subconscious mind is a repository for imagination and impulses. This is where a person stores memories and emotional experiences, right? The doctor seemed to be trying not to frown. I guess she decided I knew enough to hurt myself. I have to admit that she was probably right. However, I found enough articles on the internet to at least roughly understand where it might lead our conversation. Yes, she said after a pause, that's a pretty good summary of the basic functionality. I was put in my place. She reminded me who the expert is here. I smiled slightly. Dealing with Dr. Jameson was much like negotiating in business. If you haven't come across it in your research, hypnosis is a therapist's way of making direct contact with the subconscious, the doctor continued. Hypnosis is a deep relaxation technique, a tool that I can use to bypass the logical thinking of the mind and gain insight into Laura's experience and interpretation of these events. Today, we want to focus on memories and emotions, she said. Specifically, Laura's memories of watching her father have a long-term affair with her Aunt Ruth. She was waiting for my reaction. I felt Laura hold her breath. Okay, I replied calmly. I really didn't know how I should react to this news. Yeah, well, you know that Laura was born relatively late in her mother's life, so late that her brother is practically a different generation, right? I nodded again. So for all practical purposes, Laura can be considered an only child? I thought about it for a second or two, but there was no flaw in the logic, although it didn't help me understand Laura's behavior any better. I nodded again. Okay, Mark, can you accept the fact that Laura loved her father very much, and that her mother never fully accepted her into her life? Laura was something of an intrusion into her normal way of life. Not that she didn't love Laura, but she didn't know what to do with her. I spent so much time insisting that the doctor address me as Mr. Archer, but by that point I had forgotten why it was so important. I allowed the more personal treatment to be used without protest. Yes, I replied, I can believe it. The first time I met her parents, I felt some kind of coldness from her mother. I was never sure that she was really here, and now, even when she was looking straight at me, this impression has not changed even after several meetings. Dr. Jameson nodded. Anything else? She asked. Well, I said thoughtfully, her father was the same, only while her mother was withdrawn, her father was almost aggressively distant. It always seemed to me that he liked to dominate his family and everyone around him. I was silent for a while, and for that matter, I did see a certain closeness between him and Ruth. It wasn't too obvious, nothing worth talking about, but looking back, there were signs that they were closer than might have been expected. I waved my hand, indicating that I was done sharing my memories. True, the doctor said briefly, but that's not all. As Laura remembers it, Aunt Ruth took on most of the motherly duties while her mother concentrated on writing poetry and participating in social clubs. Until this weekend, Laura had successfully suppressed the deep-seated suspicion that she was, in fact, Aunt Ruth's child. The suspicion that she was Ruth's daughter was one of the reasons why she took Ruth's death so hard. I thought about it. I understood that if I were Laura, such uncertainty would destroy me from the inside. Isn't it possible to find out? I asked rhetorically. Dr. Jameson nodded. As part of Laura's treatment, her need to find a definitive answer to this question, she will ask for DNA testing. Her parents refused Laura spoke to them on Saturday, but she and I have discussed this conversation, and we get the impression that their refusal is more out of stubbornness than for any other reason. I think they will agree, and we will resolve this matter quite quickly and easily. And there is every indication that Laura will be able to put aside her fears that she was Ruth's daughter. I nodded. That sounds like a plan, I said casually. Yes, that's right, the doctor answered sternly. But then the hard part begins, she warned. Laura's father and aunt apparently did not think that the little girl would be able to understand or remember her father leaving Ruth's room with his clothes disheveled and, in one case, even bare-chested. In fact, although she had memories of her early years, Laura did not understand what was happening until she was a teenager, when she was already experienced enough to recognize the signs of an affair. By the age of 13 or 14, she was clearly aware that there was an affair between her father and Ruth. Even then, it seems her father and aunt made only superficial attempts to hide their relationship. The doctor looked at me carefully. So, Mark, based on your psychology study over the weekend, what do you think Laura's subconscious did with these different and opposing feelings? I tried to think. I wasn't sure what exactly she meant. Okay, Laura wasn't sure about her position in the family, I suggested. Dr. Jameson nodded. Next to me, Laura stirred. Up to this point, she had allowed the doctor and I to talk without interference. I turned to look at her more closely. It was worse than this, she said. There were many nights when I cried myself to sleep as a teenager because I didn't know who I was. Well, we'll find out soon enough, and then you can defeat this demon, right? I asked softly. Laura hesitated, but then nodded quietly. I think yes, I can, she said. Great, I said confidently. One issue has been resolved. So, you also admired your father while knowing that he did something wrong, I asked. Laura nodded. I thought about it. I raised my left hand as if holding something intangible in it. He was your father. You loved him. But he did things that hurt. I raised my right hand as if there was this pain in it. You loved him, but hated what he did. Am I close to the truth? I made a movement as if trying to balance two invisible bowls. Laura nodded, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw Dr. Jameson nod too. I frowned. I don't know how to relate this to what Laura is doing or thinking today, I admitted to the doctor. She began to shine. Her help was clearly needed. Mark, have you encountered Professor Westermark and the concept of imprinting in your research? I thought about it. Something about birds getting the false idea that humans are their parents. Almost right, Mark. Some early research into the concept of imprinting was done in animals, particularly chickens, geese, and other bird species. One researcher even flew a hang glider and microlight with a flock of geese because the movements of the craft reminded the birds of their own during migration. But this also applies to people. Your child imprinted on you as a father and on Laura as a mother, probably in the first hours or days after birth. But it doesn't end there. The infant, then the toddler, the child, the teenager, and the young adult continue to observe and learn from their parents. Most of this happens unconsciously, or through the subconscious. You can think of the subconscious as our connection to the instinctive, animal side of humans. Get the idea? I nodded. Fine. Now remember that the subconscious mind is where we store learned behavior patterns. Sometimes what we have learned may contradict what we know to be right and moral. And when conflict arises, it creates chaos in the mind, which cannot always be resolved without the intervention of the conscious mind. This is why people like me exist, and why hypnotherapy is one of my most valuable tools. When my patient is deeply relaxed and focused on me, I can bypass the conscious mind and speak directly to his subconscious. Dr. Jameson was clearly proud of herself. Her words were slow and deliberate. She tried her best to explain everything in simple terms, as I asked a few weeks ago. Laura loves you, Mark, and loves you deeply. It's hard for you to accept this now, and she understands that. You should also know that she sees you as a very driven, dynamic, and powerful person. Very strong. This is not an exaggeration at all, based on what I have learned about you in recent weeks. Do you understand this, Mark? I knew there was a slight frown on my face. I was an engineer who eventually became a businessman. My job required a certain toughness and even ruthlessness, but I tried not to bring my professional toughness home. Intellectually, I understand that, I told the doctor. I glanced at Laura. But I don't quite understand how this relates to our problems. I have never treated Laura or Alyssa the way I handle business in the company. I made sure that this didn't happen. That doesn't stop her from seeing those qualities in you, Mark, the doctor replied. She simply could not help but notice these traits in you, if only because your company was often discussed in the business circles of the city, and Laura was also part of this community, until recently. I nodded in agreement. Okay, Mark, this is where the twist begins, Dr. Jameson said, taking a deep breath. Laura tensed next to me. Mark, you need to remember that logic, as our mind uses it, does not exist in the unconscious. You understand? I shrugged. She was an expert. Okay, I'll just say it straight, she continued. On an unconscious level, Mark, Laura perceives your status in society as equivalent or even superior to that of her driven father when she was a child. The doctor looked at me carefully. Laura watched my reaction tensely, anxiously twisting her fingers. I was silent for a long time, thinking about what I had heard. I didn't like the direction of my thoughts. I cleared my throat. Laura saw me, or perceived me, as a replacement for her father, I suggested. The doctor shook her head vigorously. No, she said decisively, that's not true at all. Then will someone tell me what's wrong? I asked impatiently. Laura perceived you as a powerful, purposeful person, like her father, the doctor said slowly. But she also saw ... the ep in the subconscious. It was clearly imprinted in her consciousness that her father was having an affair. This became the norm for her, a kind of pattern in her instinctive consciousness. I tried to make sense of it. He turned to Laura. Did you think I was cheating on you? I asked indignantly. Is that why you cheated on me? I was shocked. My anger, which was already difficult for me, was already on the verge of flaring up. What made you think that? No, that's not the point, Mark, Dr. Jameson interjected. I waited, half turning towards Laura, but also trying to look at the doctor. You see, on an unconscious level, Mark, it wasn't something Laura was consciously thinking about. Her instincts were telling her that you should have cheated. I didn't say a word. Chaos reigned in my head. Dr. Jameson licked her lips. Mark, for her it was kind of normal. She saw successful, powerful men do this, and if you really started an affair, she might even turn a blind eye to it. If she caught you with another woman, her conscious mind would not be able to ignore it, but subconsciously she would immediately forgive you, just like her mother did. She also had this image imprinted on her. I frowned. But you didn't cooperate, Mark, the doctor continued. You were so obviously faithful to her that even her subconscious couldn't interpret your late-night meetings, business dinners, or any other work activities as anything other than what they really were. I looked at her silently. And then she herself committed treason? I said sarcastically. Exactly, Dr. Jameson replied firmly. My face showed shock, and icy rage spread through my body. I tried to pull myself together. Her subconscious knew, in quotes, that cheating happens in successful families. When you didn't do it. I jumped up without realizing it. This is nonsense, I said carefully. This is just some kind of nonsense that justifies my wife for cheating, betraying our marriage, me and our daughter. I turned and walked out the door before Dr. Jameson or Laura could recover from the shock of my sudden, almost violent movement and harsh words. I didn't stop until I was safe in my big SUV. Laura, I stand in front of the mirror, looking at myself in surprise. According to the reflection, I'm still the same as before. My height is still the same 5 feet 5 inches. I still have shoulder-length brown hair and green eyes. My skin is still smooth, even though I will be 30 in the fall. Those barely noticeable freckles are still visible on the bridge of the nose. When I take off this dress, I will see the same 36C breasts that I got after Alyssa was born. The left breast has sagged slightly. It is slightly lower than the right. Mark always said he didn't notice it. They were both perfect for him. I wish it were so, but I know it isn't. My hips widened smoothly from my narrow waist. He loved just watching me move. He said that only a beautiful woman could move as gracefully as I did. But now he doesn't say that anymore. Now I don't know who I am. I look into my eyes in the mirror and try to see something, but they show me nothing. I can't explain to Mark how much I suffer because I hurt him so deeply. The shame of sleeping with another man haunts me constantly. I can't get rid of it. If there was any way to explain to my husband, my love, how I really feel, I would do it. But he doesn't want to listen to me. I'm afraid I hurt him too much. We hadn't spoken much since Mark left Dr. Jameson's office, just a few short conversations about what to do or how to deal with Alyssa. I don't even know what to tell him. Dr. Jameson says I need to let go of my guilt, but I don't know how. It's my fault. It's my fault that I cheated on Mark, and I cheated on Alyssa too. My God, the memories of what I said to him the last night I was with this Brian haunt me day and night. I can't sleep without hearing those terrible words again. I don't deserve a man like Mark. He was right to push me away the way he did. I can't explain why those long months when I was dating Brian seemed so unreal to me. It was as if I were wearing pillows instead of shoes. The ground did not seem solid under my feet, but at the same time in my head, I saw myself walking along the edge of an endless razor blade. It seemed that if I took the slightest wrong step, I would cut my legs to shreds and fall, and then die. This is how I saw my life. How can I explain the fog that filled my mind for so long? I couldn't think. I couldn't reason. When Mark spoke to me, I heard only incomprehensible sounds that were drowned in the piercing noises that had already filled me. I wanted to hear him, but I couldn't. It's very difficult for me to remember what I did. I'm trying. I need to understand this in order to recover, but there's nothing to grab onto. Everything that happened in those days, in those months, it was like it happened to someone else, even though I was there, watching me do all this. Dr. Jameson nods when I talk about this. She says she understands what I'm saying, but she really can't. Nobody can. Sometimes I think that I will explode and all the pieces of me will scatter on the ground. I don't know how this will all end. I think one day I will disappear and then peace will come again. It's been 3 months. 3 months since Mark and I spoke with Dr. Jameson in her office. I feel better. I am no longer afraid when Dr. Jameson wants to put me into what she calls a light trance. Now she can do it very quickly. She doesn't snap her fingers like they do on stage, but now I can focus much better and she can ask whatever she wants. I am no longer ashamed of what she can bring out from the depths of my mind. She found so much, and later, when she brought me out of my trance, we discussed everything she talked about with me while I was under hypnosis. Sometimes when I just talk about it outside of deep relaxation, it goes away as if it wasn't there to begin with. I don't see how this is possible, but Dr. Jameson says not to worry about it. It's just my mind dealing with whatever it is and resolving it. She says that's why she's raising these issues. This is so that I can consciously look them in the eye and put them away like clothes that I no longer want to wear, clothes that I no longer need. It's nice to put them aside. I feel fresh and clean again. But the pain always comes back when I think about my little girl and my husband. Baby steps, Dr. Jameson tells me. Big problems are not easy to solve, she says. This takes time and a lot of work. There are times when Dr. Jameson has to help me deal with a problem in a different way, like with my father and mother. Dr. Jameson talked them into coming here from Albany for a week. It took everything I had to face my dad and tell him how bad he made me feel when I saw him walk out of Aunt Ruth's room with his shirt over his pants and everything. I told him that when I saw Aunt Ruth in a black tank top, kissing and hugging him. I told him that I wanted to hurt him when I saw that. Didn't he know it was wrong? I asked him why, but I actually yelled at him. I made my father cry. I've never seen him cry before. I also shouted at my mother. Why did she let him do this? Has she ever thought how terrible I feel knowing that my mother is a cuckoo but can't do anything about it? Why didn't she do anything? I didn't even realize how old my mom and dad were until I saw them cry in front of me. I couldn't stand it. I knelt down between their chairs and hugged them both. I just wanted them to love me and love each other. We cried together, and then Dr. Jameson spoke quietly to all 3 of us for a long time. Mom, Dad, and I talked until we were tired. My mother told me how she discovered early on that she had no sex drive at all. She told me that she just couldn't get past the humiliation of sex, the complete exposure of herself, the sweat and the mess. She said that when she gave birth to me, it was one of the few times she overcame all this and made wonderful love with Daddy. She said she was sorry, but there was nothing she could do about it. It was she who suggested that my dad go somewhere else. Her sister had been widowed the year before and was a single woman. This seemed ideal. Her sister always had sexual desire and suffered without her man. Dad was a healthy man, and he actually didn't have a woman. My mom told me that everyone was very careful at first, but it was hard to keep track of where I was all the time. She was very sorry that I found out about this. Dad was there too. He knelt down and held me, begging me to forgive him. I told him yes, and it was true. I no longer slammed my head into a huge brick wall. Dr. Jameson talked to Mom and Dad several hours a day for the rest of the week. When they went home, they both looked much happier than I had seen them in years. Mom was hanging on Dad like she was a newlywed, which is how I used to look when Mark and I were hanging out together. Now I'm stronger. It had been almost 6 months since Dr. Jameson first hypnotized me. I see things much clearer. I did, said, and felt so many things that I now realize were incredibly stupid. First of all, I cannot imagine how I allowed myself to get into such situations. Why did I let myself be talked into going out for drinks with these girls? I just don't know. I think this was the beginning. Dr. Jameson gave me a list of books to read, and it was an eye-opener. Alcohol takes over a woman and turns her inside out. It dulls thought processes and reduces inhibitions to the point of non-existence. Drinking is also a self-destructive act. This causes the body to react harshly to get rid of poisons and changes the body's chemistry. Dr. Jameson helped me realize that I was drinking a lot so that I could numb myself and not deal with what I was feeling. It didn't work. This only made me more vulnerable to Brian. It was easy for him to convince me to sleep with him, even though I really didn't like him. I knew that he was one of those men who think that every woman is a party and who feels nothing for a woman as a person. I knew from the very beginning that he was a mean person, and I knew it every time I allowed him to do something to me. Dr. Jameson, and I think I demeaned myself by stooping to the level where I felt I was equal to Mom, Dad, and Aunt Ruth. They were my whole life for so long. I think something inside me said that they were the best I could be, and so I tried to be them. It didn't work. I knew better, being with my dear husband and daughter. That's why it tore me apart. It's been hard to break this conditioning, but I'm finally here. We also discovered that part of me saw Alyssa as a rival for Mark's affections. It was stupid, but it made me feel irritated whenever he and Mark were around. Dr. Jameson and the specialist she brought in believe it started after Alyssa was born. A little later, to be exact. Many people call this postpartum depression, which is essentially depression that occurs immediately after giving birth. I don't understand why so much attention is paid to this, because it's unfair. In any case, I didn't reach postpartum psychosis, fortunately. I have never had a moment when I wanted to hurt myself or my child. But what really happened was that I was so tired, exhausted all the time, and yet I couldn't sleep. I was very irritable. I thought Mark didn't love me anymore, but I didn't understand why I felt that way. He never stopped hugging me and telling me how much he loved me, but it seemed to me that I was very far from him and from everyone else too. It didn't help that I had all these thoughts about Mom and Dad in my head. I was a complete mess. I wanted to be a good mother, but I was so sensitive that I couldn't breastfeed Alyssa without crying in pain. And when I started getting irritable, Mark started giving Alyssa her formula more often, changing her diapers and rocking her in his arms when she cried. I don't think I've ever gotten up at 2 a.m. to feed her. It was always her wonderful father. Now I understand how special it was. Other women I talked to said they would have given anything if their husbands had done this even once or twice a week when their children were little. Dr. Jameson says my hormones were probably out of whack too. I know that for a long time I didn't want Mark to touch me. And when she wanted to, he didn't notice it at first, and a lot of time passed before we became close again. Even when it happened, it seemed like I was still holding back a little, but I'm not sure if I remember that or just realize it now, looking back. And then I let that idiot Brian seduce me, and everything went wrong. Or it all went wrong, and I let Brian do something to me. I don't know what it was, but it's easier for me to think this way. I know it's not very accurate, but it doesn't bother me anymore, and Dr. Jameson says that's what matters. Sometimes I get so angry at myself. How could I be so stupid? Most of the things I did when I was drinking and running around with that Brian don't make any sense to me now. It's been 8.5 months since my husband, and I sat down with Dr. Jameson to discuss my first hypnosis session, deep relaxation hypnotherapy, as Dr. Jameson likes to call it. Sometimes she gets angry because, according to her, any charlatan can hypnotize someone on stage. But you need to be a professional to help people with their problems using such methods. She taught me self-hypnosis techniques and how to bring out hidden thoughts from my subconscious when I felt something was bothering me. She also helped me learn to recognize the signs that something was bothering me. It's really very simple, and I'm so upset that I didn't know about it before I messed it up. Sometimes the shame of what I did to this Brian almost overwhelms me. Whatever my mom, dad, and Aunt Ruth did with each other, she was a big influence on me too. Well, none of them raised me to act like a promiscuous woman. Of course, they were never so obvious in their actions. Dr. Jameson and I discovered that part of me rebelled against what I was doing. We discovered that I began to drink more and behave more and more promiscuously so that Mark would find out and stop me. It was so self-destructive and humiliating at the same time that I still can't believe it. And I knew full well that one of Mark's companies was engaged in a large-scale investigation. In any case, I would be exposed one day, no matter what I did. The fact that I acted so stupidly only accelerated this process. We still haven't figured out why I chose this path to stop myself from cheating. Dr. Jameson constantly reminds me that the subconscious mind does not process information as consistently as it does in the conscious mind. It's annoying, but all this therapy has made me so much more aware of myself. I now know I'll never find myself in a downward spiral like that again. I know myself too well, and now I know how to observe myself. I can share what I learn with others. Last week, I started working at a victim hotline downtown, and I think surely one of that group of girls I used to go out drinking with is about to go to counseling for her drinking problem. I told her I would take her to the meeting, help her find a sponsor, and all that. She burst into tears. She was so grateful that at least someone showed even the slightest concern for her. I felt so good because I was able to help her. I'm going to accompany her all the way. What about me? I tried some wine the other day, and it almost made me vomit. Christmas has passed almost a year since I first learned about hypnosis. I see Alyssa 2 to 3 times a week. Mark allows me to see her anytime I want, just call him. It's not the same as living with her and her husband, but it's better than nothing. She will soon be 5. She's growing up so fast, and I'm not around. I have very little to talk about with Dr. Jameson when I come to see her. I feel so energized and excited just to be alive. I really feel good. I know I've done so many bad things, but I feel like this was a different Laura. I am no longer the woman who was stupid enough to push her husband away. Not anymore. I've been feeling anxious lately. I haven't made love to my husband for so long. I want him madly. I won't be whole again until I get back to him and our daughter. I talked to Dr. Jameson about this. I told her that I didn't think Mark loved me anymore, and that I didn't know what to do about it. She asked what gave me such an idea, and I told her how he is sometimes cold, does not allow me to get too close, and talk to him alone and stuff like that. She snorted. She does this when she wants to appear superior to everyone, but now I just stick my tongue out at her. We only do this behind closed doors so no one can see. She's closer to me than my mother has been for a long time, but even that has changed. Mom called me recently and was so happy on the phone. She and Dad were going on a cruise to Jamaica to get reacquainted with each other, she said. I was amazed. It turned out that Dr. Jameson's treatment and subsequent counseling at home brought out something in Mom that she never expected. We cried for a long time, but they were good tears. So I told Dr. Jameson that I wanted my husband back, but I didn't think I could do it. He doesn't seem to care. When she stopped snorting, she asked me if Mark had filed for divorce. Mark didn't, but I explained that his lawyer probably told him it would look bad to divorce his wife who was in therapy. Dr. Jameson almost snorted again, but held back. She asked if she had ever charged me a penny for all the precious time we had used over the past year. She said Mark could have stopped therapy at any time without paying for it, but he didn't. I knew about it, but I didn't think about it the way Dr. Jameson did. This got me thinking. She asked when was the last time Mark didn't let me see Alyssa. Of course, this was not the case. She said I should think about it. This doesn't sound like something a person would do if they wanted to cut me out of their life. Then I said that I didn't think Mark would want me back because I acted like a slutty and rude woman and was so cruel to him and Alyssa. She snorted seriously this time. I told her it was impressive and we laughed about it together. I really appreciate Dr. Jameson. She is so calm, collected, and reasonable all the time. She told me that Mark wasn't so much worried about sex as he was about betrayal and breaking our marriage vows. His pain is because I left our marriage, not something physical. I didn't want to do this. Deep down, I knew it. If I could control myself, I would never have done any of the things I did. I feel disgusted when I think about the cheap hotels we went to, the shady places where we drank and danced until the morning, and about sex. Sex worries me the most. Except for those 6 months, I never allowed any man other than Mark to even kiss me, other than a friendly kiss on the cheek. All of this is completely separate from the pain I caused Mark and Alyssa. I'm terribly sorry about that too, but I don't know how to apologize more than I already do every time Mark gives me a chance. Dr. Jameson asked me if Mark would be willing to come in for a joint consultation. She said he clearly has a lot of anger to deal with. She also said that if Mark knew that I had found myself, if he was convinced that I had lost myself for a while, but was now recovering, then perhaps he would want to work on our marriage rather than destroy it. I told her that the last time I tried to talk to him about going back to working with her, he didn't even answer my question. Dr. Jameson asked how long ago it had been, and I had to wonder. This was many months ago. She said a lot can change in a matter of days, let alone months. She also said that Mark might be looking for a sign from me that I wanted to work with him to preserve what we had, or better yet, find a way to overcome what divided us and create a new relationship. Then I had to leave because her next client came. All these thoughts got me thinking. I remembered little things that stood out to me. How Mark didn't really push me away as much as he could have. I once caught him looking at me as I was leaving after bringing Alyssa. I thought, maybe I was just misinterpreting his facial expression, which could be a sign of pain and suffering. I think I'll call him tonight. He is always home by 6 because he takes full care of Alyssa. After dinner, they play games, watch Disney, or read books. At this time, he is always in a good mood. I think I'll call him and ask if he'd be willing to come to a couple of my therapy sessions, maybe just to see how I'm doing. Perhaps this will make a greater impression on him. I hope so. I want my man back. I want to be his wife and lover more than anything in the world. If he takes me back, I know that I can make our little girl happy again because she will have a mother again. But first I want my husband back. I will fight for him. I'll make him see that I'm his woman. I have a grandson, Carl announced. I looked at him over the top of my large coffee mug. Sometimes I felt like I was supporting Juan Valdez's business. There was always a huge thermos of coffee in the main office, and I drank my share and sometimes even more. Lately, I've had to switch to decaf in the afternoons, otherwise I'd end up driving home to Alyssa with jangled nerves and fingers drumming on the steering wheel. Carl drank tea. I think it avoided a lot of my caffeine problems. Yes, I know, I replied. 2, I've seen them a couple of times. It was true. Carl brought his wife and children, as well as their offspring, to every family gathering or dinner the company hosted. I said this a little jokingly. I met his grandchildren not twice, but much more often. I have watched his 3 granddaughters and 2 grandsons grow from babies into young ladies and gentlemen. But Carl shook his head. No, now I have 3 grandchildren. I cocked my head to the side. This was news to me. I didn't say anything. Carl has become one of my closest confidantes over the past year or so. He helped me identify and document my wife's infidelity, and then quietly disbanded the team of detectives who were doing the job. No one except him and my personal secretary and assistant Maggie knew all the details of this tragedy. My daughter Janet's eldest son, Zane, was institutionalized for many years, Carl said quietly. He's 15 now. I didn't know, Carl, I answered softly. I'm so sorry. I should have been more careful. I felt terrible. He waved his hand casually. No problem, he replied. He was already in treatment in Colorado when I came here to work. And unfortunately, he is no longer a part of our daily lives, although we see him when we can. I nodded, still feeling uncomfortable. It seemed like I had somehow failed him. Zane is a big guy for his age. Already 6 feet tall, Carl said thoughtfully. His weight goes up and down. Sometimes he'll weigh up to 250 pounds, and then he'll forget to eat for a long time, and he'll be down to 170 before he knows it. Carl stirred in his seat. The leather of the chair creaked under his movements. For most of his life, Zane doesn't live in the present. He hears voices that disturb him, confuse him, and cause him to hurt others. Carl looked at the mug of tea, spinning it in slow circles. He's physically very strong, but mentally, he's very immature and hard to handle. Some days he's like a silly, kind 10-year-old boy. Other times, when he's in his paranoid stage, he's your worst nightmare. My daughter couldn't handle it. He's gotten bigger and stronger since he was 11, and we had to go through hell to get him institutionalized. Carl stirred the tea mug with a spoon, although this was not necessary. His face was gloomy. We hope they can work with Zane and teach him how to deal with his demons so he can survive on his own when he grows up, but there are no guarantees. Now he can distinguish the voices in his head from real people, and this gives us great hope. He responded well to some treatments. Carl coughed into his fist and glanced at me quickly. Have you seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, boss? He asked. I nodded. Well, he continued, the doctors say it's about my grandson Zane. If you want to understand my grandson, watch this film. I nodded again. My gaze was fixed on one point on the wall while I recalled the heartbreaking scenes from this film. I shook my head. I'm so sorry, Carl, I said, not knowing what else to say. I wish I knew, I added. He shook his head again. There was nothing you could do, he said shortly. I'm not the kind of person who talks about such things just like that. For the first time in a long time, he turned to face me in his chair. Boss, I'm not ashamed of my grandson, although I don't talk about him to almost anyone. My wife and I don't discuss it because it causes too much pain, and if we don't control it, we just won't be able to get through the day. You know what I mean? I nodded, and my face must have reflected the sympathy I felt for my senior vice president and friend. He turned away. I wanted to say that. Well, it's not Zane's fault, you know. He didn't wake up one morning and decide that his mind had to go down a path where we couldn't reach him. We couldn't help him. Carl cleared his throat several times and took long sips of his tea before continuing. This gave me time to think, too. Boss, he continued with confusion, you've let me into your life more than I ever expected. You have entrusted me with running my part of the corporation at my discretion, and I appreciate that. I respect you more than anyone I've ever worked with, and I think you respect me back. I nodded, and so it was. Here's the thing, boss, Carl began. I just can't sit and watch. I raised my hand to stop him. It's not Laura's fault either, I said quietly. He nodded, carefully watching my reaction. I sighed heavily. Carl touched on something that I had been aware of for a long time. Yes, Carl, you're right, I finally said. I still have a problem, no, more of a question why Laura couldn't talk to me about what was bothering her in the first place. I might not have understood everything right away, but she could at least say something. I bit the inside of my cheek as I thought about it. I hear what you're saying, Carl. She didn't mean to let her mind play tricks on her, but some of her actions were so treacherous that I just... My hands made a helpless gesture. Carl nodded, understanding. But Mark, he said softly, can you let it go? Can you understand deep down that if she had controlled her thoughts, she would never have done any of these things? If she had been the Laura you married, the Laura I know, and not a woman torn by problems she couldn't understand or cope with, she would never have cheated. You know that. I know you know that. He watched as I struggled with these thoughts. I wanted to say yes, but images of that last night still popped into my head. It is curious that Laura's rage, which erupted at that moment in Las Vegas, also brought her to her senses, brought her out of the foggy state in which she had been for so long. I learned at least that much from listening to Dr. Jameson. Boss, Carl continued softly, if Laura had cancer and was going through chemotherapy, losing her hair and everything, would be weak to the bones and skin and pale and powerless, would you blame her for getting sick? Could you do it? I sat motionless for a long time. I already had similar thoughts, but Carl provided me with such a vivid image that it was impossible to ignore or push it aside. He made me look inside myself and ask myself, who am I really? Am I a real person or just a movie stereotype? Do I want my pride or rather ego? And instinctive disgust at Laura sharing her body with another man became the defining features of my masculinity. Either Carl read my thoughts as if they were written on my forehead, or he turned out to be much more insightful than I gave him credit for. Mark, he said quietly, if you met a young divorced woman, let's call her, I don't know, Laura, and you thought about building a serious relationship with her, you would ask her, or even be interested, how many times she had sex before she met you, with whom it was, and what kind of sex it was. Would you do that? He asked the question with a challenge in his voice. I thought so, he concluded, seeing the answer on my face. In fact, these would be things that did not concern me, elements of the past of Karlova, a fictional divorced woman, her personal memories. These would be things that a man who married a divorcee would quietly accept. He would live with her past as a given, without feeling humiliation, without seeking revenge. If he were a real man, and she would accept his past too, confident that he is with her now, and not with the women he was with before. Suddenly, I remembered several parties I had been to with one of my ex-girlfriends before I met Laura. I haven't thought about those wild parties in a long time. It's been many years, but some of the things I did there didn't make me proud. Laura lived with these facts, although she did not know about them. They were a part of who I became, just like the high school football games I played in. These things made me who I am. I've learned what I don't want to do, what to avoid, and who I don't want to be. Charles, I called, leaning back in my comfortable, padded executive chair. His eyebrows rose in question. I know you have a degree in criminology, Carl, but did you also have a second major in applied psychology? I asked with a slight smile. He grinned and shook his head. No, he said curtly, but I was a cop for 17 years, boss. You see all sorts of things in a police car. His face darkened. My grandson taught me a lot too, boss. I must admit that I did not begin this experience with him with the same correct attitude as I have now. He was about to say something else, but I raised my hand to stop him. Don't beat yourself up about it, Carl, I said sympathetically. I think we all have to learn as we go, and I learned a lot today, my friend. Thank you, I said simply. Come on, he answered with a smile. You already followed this path. I just pushed you forward a little bit and maybe a little faster. At that moment, the phone rang, interrupting what I was about to say. It was Maggie on the intercom. Yes, Maggie, I said, pressing the button to turn on the speakerphone. Mark, Laura is on the phone, she said quietly. I froze for a moment. Connect her, please, I finally said. I turned to apologize to Carl for interrupting the conversation, but he had already disappeared through the side door leading to his office. As a farewell, he gave me the "it's okay" gesture before disappearing. Doctor, I said quietly, I have found ways to cope with almost everything related to this story, but I still have the question of why my wife was not able to talk to me about what was bothering her in the first place. I might not understand right away, but at least she could have said something. The doctor thought for a while, looking at me carefully. I understood that in the depths of her mind, there was a memory of how more than a year ago I got up and left when I didn't like her words. I'm not going anywhere, I said with a wry smile. Her eyes widened slightly. She didn't expect that I could read it so easily. She smiled back at me. She couldn't express her feelings clearly enough to make sense even to herself, Mark, the doctor said. And this is assuming that she would have even realized when the first echoes of memories began to torment her, she added. Back then, Laura didn't have the tools to work with her emotions. Now I have them, Laura added decisively. I'll talk to you about what's bothering me, even if I have to break down the bathroom door while you... Well, you know what I mean, she concluded. I blinked, stunned. Ah, I don't think you'll have to go that far, I muttered. Both women laughed as they saw the blush of embarrassment rise from my neck to my ears. It was nice to hear Laura's cheerful laugh again. I haven't heard from him for a long time. She squeezed my hand. Her palms grabbed my hand tightly, and she didn't let go. We sat next to each other, our arms and shoulders touching each other. I felt comfortable with this intimacy again. I overcame the barrier with Carl's help and had no intention of going back. As Laura said, Mark, she now has the tools to deal with you and any worries that may emerge from her subconscious. There are no guarantees, but she is now much better prepared. It took a long time, Mark, for Laura to get to this point, and there are still things we need to explore, but she has overcome her major demons. Of course, there will be moments that you will have to resolve as a couple, but Laura and I are confident that there will no longer be such an avalanche-like confluence of problems that will fall on her at the same time. What about you, Mark? Asked the doctor. Are you okay with what we discussed? I took a deep breath. Dr. Jameson, with the help of a good friend, I have worked through most of the issues. I smiled briefly at the doctor. A few months ago, I objected to this word. A friend of mine shared a story about his young grandson suffering from a mental disorder similar to the one depicted in the movie A Beautiful Mind, and what Carl's family went through made me reconsider my anger and look at it from a different perspective. The doctor nodded, expressing her sympathy for me and for Carl's family. I had to reevaluate a lot of things, I continued, and I let go of the pent-up anger and disgust I felt. I thought for a minute. I'm not saying I'm completely healed, but it's not the central part I'm holding on to anymore, I added. I turned to my wife. There will be times, I'm sure, when things will get to me again, and I'll let some harsh words come out that might hurt you, Laura. But I will also get better, and I won't stop working on it, okay? Laura's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back. She just nodded and stroked my hand. Honey, I said, there is still a part of me that wants to say that there is no excuse, no reason for what you did, and that I should not allow you back into my heart, into my life. But I refuse to give in to this feeling. I looked at my wife's face as she looked at me intently. The last time we were together in Dr. Jameson's office, she was still weak, still recovering, and crying often. She could rarely meet my gaze firmly. Now in front of me was the woman I married again, and maybe even a little stronger. Sometimes the weld is stronger than the original material. I think if I can tell you that I forgive you for what you did, but also understand that I can't fully atone for your actions, then I can move on with less difficulty. I fell silent, waiting for someone to say something, but no one broke the silence. I just don't think we can live like nothing happened, Laura. There was too much pain and suffering, on everyone's part, for it to just go away. I can live with it. But I want to use these terrible events to my advantage, Mark, Laura said carefully. I can't forget them, but if I use them as a reminder of what I should never repeat, they become a tool for me. You understand? I nodded in understanding. Is there anything else, Mark? Dr. Jameson was silent for a moment. I took a deep breath, lifted my shoulders to relax them, and let them drop again. I think some men will see me as a cuckold in the old sense of the word, a weak man who is despised by everyone around him, I said slowly. It was unusual for me to speak so openly with a person whom I knew so little as our consultant. I will have to face these men on their terms. Few of them will be people whose opinions are valuable to me, but still, I will have to deal with them. Dr. Jameson shook her head in disagreement. I don't think you'll have to deal with this, Mark, she said firmly. I don't see weaklings in my practice. Weak people, whether men or women, accept abuse from their spouses without objecting to it. The doctor glanced at Laura and allowed a brief grin to cross her lips before turning back to me. Laura and I have already discussed certain things, she said, and if anyone has ever taken drastic measures, short of violence, to put an end to something they could not tolerate, it is this man you. She spoke firmly. She paused, hand half raised. She didn't finish. I've told you this before, Mark, but there's a side to you that you rarely show, and almost never to Laura. I suspect your daughter, too. You can be absolutely merciless and unyielding towards those who betrayed you. And Laura understands this on a deep level. If nothing else, if no other insight came from all of this, she now knows that you will never accept the kind of behavior she exhibited then. The doctor shuddered slightly. Oh, and I don't think many people will think badly of you, she added. I think they will see your compassion and look at the love between you, rather than the circumstances that brought you to where you are now. She looked at me and smiled. But if you have to challenge some scoundrel to a duel, then go for it, she concluded. I'll hold your coat while you beat the bastard half to death, honey, Laura said softly, and then we'll go home together, okay? I could do nothing else but kiss my woman's lips, which she held out to me. I had a hard time securing the car seat in the cab of the truck. It wasn't easy. Trucks are not designed for small children and their car seats, but I managed in the end. Alyssa had been waiting for a while. Her patience was almost exhausted. As soon as I finished, she plopped down in a protective chair. Hurry, Dad, she said, hurrying me to fasten her seat belt. Should I take off my shoes or leave them on? I teased. This time my 5-year-old daughter hesitated. She's older now, but still loves the tickle game that inevitably follows after taking off her shoes. She didn't like being in a car seat, but she was still so small. I needed to know that she would be safe if I made a mistake on the road. Leave it, she finally answered. Come on, Dad, hurry up, she demanded. I smiled. I'm doing the best I can, honey, I told her. I closed the passenger door, ran around the hood so she could see I was really in a hurry, and climbed into the cabin. A few minutes later, we were on the highway, heading west out of town. We drove to the house of Uncle Dan, Laura's brother, and we both couldn't wait to get there. Laura had been living with her brother for the last year or so while we tried to mend our relationship. Today, my little daughter and I were taking her mother and my wife home to where she belongs. Of course, it didn't end there. Laura and I still had many trust issues that needed to be resolved and worked through. I know that I watched her every move for a long time. I'm sure my suspicions showed on my face at times, but Laura always took the time to explain everything I asked. I'm absolutely sure that on some level she resented this. She wouldn't be human if she didn't get offended, but she took it calmly. But then again, maybe she thought it was something she needed to do. 2 years ago, she called me in an almost hysterical state, begging me to understand that she was stuck in traffic and would not be able to return home at the promised time. I had to help her calm down a little so she could continue moving safely. I could see from city traffic that there had been a major accident on the highway ahead that was backing up traffic for miles in both directions. Using the map, I showed her the nearest exit and indicated which streets would be better for her to get home than to sit in this endless traffic jam. The point is that her anxiety calmed me too. Now I worry much less when such delays arise. I'm gradually getting rid of most of my suspicions, but neither she nor I will ever forget why unexplained lateness or lack of communication still bothers us. By the way, I myself always try to let her know if I'm late. We no longer discuss why this is important. This is already clear. I sit here in the darkness of our living room, lit only by the ghostly light of the moon coming through the side window. I like this time of day. There is no noise from traffic on the street, no fuss and anxiety. Everything seems to slow down. The night envelops me with its calm. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.